the wealthiest, most powerful man in the territory. And his wife stands in the town square in the dead of winter, no coat, no shoes, nothing but the eyes of an entire town pressing down on her like stone. 7 years. 7 years she endured this in silence, and for 7 years, not a single soul spoke up. Until today. Until a stranger stepped out of the crowd, pulled the coat from his own back, and looked the most powerful man in Ash Hollow dead in the eye and said, "Touch her again, and you'll regret drawing another breath." Like, comment your city below so I can see how far this story has traveled. And don't go anywhere, because this is only the begin. The cold came early to Ash Hollow that year. By the second week of October, frost had already crept into the cracks between the floorboards of every building on Main Street, and the mud that passed for a road had gone stiff overnight, rutted and uneven from wagon wheels that no longer bothered slowing down for anybody. The mountains to the northwest had been white-capped since late September, which the old-timers said was a sign of hard weather ahead. They said it every year. This year, for once, they were right. Ash Hollow was not a town that inspired much pride in the people who lived there. It had grown up fast and badly in the decade after the mining rush faded, the kind of settlement that happens when a few men with money decide a particular patch of land is worth owning and everyone else just sort of accumulates around the edges of that decision. There was a general store owned by a man named Briggs who watered down his grain alcohol and kept 2 sets of ledgers. There was a livery stable that smelled worse in winter than it did in summer, which was an accomplishment. There was a sheriff's office with a broken lock on the cell door that nobody had fixed in 3 years. And there was the Crow Ranch, which sat at the northern end of the valley like a fist, its fences running farther than most men cared to walk in a single day, its cattle herds large enough to make half the county dependent on Silas Crow's goodwill for their livelihoods. Silas Crow was 51 years old and had the build of a man who had worked hard in his youth and spent the last 20 years making other people work hard for him. He was not especially tall, but he carried himself like he was, shoulders back, chin lifted, the kind of posture that came from never having been seriously told no. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and he kept his mustache trimmed neatly, which people often mistook for vanity. It wasn't vanity, it was control. Silas Crow controlled everything he could reach, and he had spent 30 years making sure he could reach farther every season. He had married Evelyn Hart 11 years ago, when she was 23 and he was 40, and she had arrived in Ash Hollow with her widowed mother and a trunk that held everything they owned. Her mother had died the following winter. After that, there was no one to go back to and nowhere else to go, and Silas had known that from the beginning. That was the thing about Silas. He always understood the shape of a person's desperation before they did. It was his particular talent. Evelyn Cross, she had stopped thinking of herself as Evelyn Crow somewhere around the 4th year, though she never said so out loud, was 34 years old on the morning everything changed, and she looked older. Not in the way that meant she'd lived richly or traveled far or laughed too much in the sun. She looked older the way a piece of wood looks older after years of weather, stripped, dried out, the grain of it pulled tight. She was still handsome in the bones of her face, the wide-set dark eyes, the strong jaw. But her eyes had developed a habit of going flat when she was in public, like she was covering a window with a cloth so no one could see inside. She had learned that habit on purpose. It was safer. The morning of October 14th started like most mornings started in Ash Hollow. Evelyn was up before dawn, which she always was, because the kitchen fire needed to be going by the time Silas woke, or there would be consequences that weren't worth cataloging. She built the fire with the careful, practiced efficiency of someone who has done a thing so many times it no longer requires thought, and she had the coffee boiling and the bread sliced by the time she heard his boots on the stairs. Silas came into the kitchen without greeting her, which was normal. He poured his own coffee, which he always did, and stood at the window looking out at his fields the way a man looks at something he owns and is satisfied about owning. He drank half the cup. Then he said, without turning around, "You forgot to close the gate on the south pen last night." Evelyn kept her hands still on the counter. "I closed it. I always close it." Henderson says 3 head got out this morning. Henderson was drunk before supper yesterday. He probably left it open himself. She heard him set the cup down on the table. Not hard, just set it down, and there was something in that deliberate gentleness that was worse than if he'd slammed it. He turned around slowly. You're calling my foreman a liar. I'm saying I closed that gate. Silas looked at her for a long moment with his pale eyes that never quite matched the expression on his face. Then he nodded, almost to himself, like he'd come to a decision. You'll come to town with me this morning, he said. I need to pick up the supply order from Briggs. She understood immediately what that meant. He did this sometimes. Brought her into town after a confrontation, made her stand beside him while he conducted business, made sure everyone could see that she was still there, still his, still precisely where he'd put her. It was a particular kind of reminder, not for her, for everyone else. All right, she said. She did not say anything else. Main Street was already moving by the time Silas pulled the wagon up in front of Briggs's general store. It was a Thursday, which meant the weekly supply wagons had come in from the outlying ranches, and there were half a dozen men loading and unloading goods in the cold morning air, their breath coming out in small white clouds. A group of women stood near the post office sharing news, their voices lowered in the way that meant the news was interesting. Two of Silas's hired men were leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon, and they straightened up when they saw him, the automatic straightening of men who understand exactly where the money comes from. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon herself. Silas didn't offer a hand. She pulled her shawl tighter and followed him inside. Briggs was behind the counter, a short, red-faced man who always smiled too wide when Silas walked in, the smile of someone who owed money and was grateful it hadn't been called due yet. He had Silas's order already pulled together: flour, salt, ammunition, 3 bolts of canvas, a new axle pin for one of the ranch wagons. While Silas checked the figures against his own list, Evelyn stood near the door and waited. This was her place during these errands, to stand and wait, to be present without being present, if that made any sense. She had gotten good at it. After about 20 minutes, Silas finished with Briggs and walked out. Evelyn followed. He stopped on the wooden sidewalk and turned to her. You forgot to add thread to the order, he said. She had not been asked to add thread to the order. She had not been told there was an order for her to contribute to. She said this quietly. I told you last week, Silas said. His voice was even, pleasant, the voice he used in public. I told you we were running low. You should have remembered. You didn't tell me. You'll do this every time, he said, still pleasant, still even. And he was speaking louder now, not much louder, just enough that the men at the hitching post could hear, just enough that the women by the post office had gone quiet. You'll stand there and tell me I'm wrong about my own words, like you don't hear right or you don't care to. Evelyn felt the cold more acutely than she had a moment before. She was aware of the people. She was always aware of the people when he did this. That was the point. You didn't mention thread, she said again, and her voice was steady, but her hands inside her shawl were not. Take off your shawl, Silas said. She looked at him. You heard me? He still had that pleasant quality in his voice, the most terrible kind of pleasantness. Take it off. It's the one you bought without asking me, and I've decided I don't care for it. The temperature was somewhere around 30 degrees. The wind was coming down off the mountains in irregular gusts. Several people on Main Street had stopped moving entirely. Silas, take it off, Evelyn, or I'll take it off for you. She took it off. Her fingers were clumsy with the cold, but she managed it, and she stood there on the wooden sidewalk holding the shawl she was no longer allowed to wear while the wind came through her thin dress like it wasn't there. Silas took the shawl from her hands and folded it over his arm calmly, like a man folding a newspaper. You'll learn to ask, he said. He went back inside to complete some piece of business he'd apparently forgotten. Nobody on Main Street moved. Nobody said anything. The women by the post office had gone absolutely still. The men at the hitching post were looking at the ground, or the sky, or their boots, any direction that wasn't her. Evelyn stood in the cold and kept her face empty and tried to remember how to breathe normally. She had done this before. She knew how to get through it. She just had to wait. She did not hear him arrive. She heard the sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk, deliberate and unhurried, and then a coat settled over her shoulders from behind. A heavy leather coat, lined with wool, still warm from whoever had been wearing it. And she spun around reflexively, something between fear and surprise. The man standing behind her was someone she had never seen before in Ash Hollow. He was tall, considerably taller than Silas, with the kind of build that came from physical labor spread across a lot of years. heavy through the shoulders, his hands large and rough-knuckled, a burn scar climbing the back of his left hand and up his wrist. He was wearing a plain flannel shirt now, no coat obviously, and he seemed unbothered by the cold in the automatic way of men who spend a lot of time outdoors. His hair was dark and needed cutting. He had several days of beard that he hadn't gotten around to dealing with. He was maybe 40, maybe a few years older, and his face was the kind of face that had absorbed a significant amount of weather and trouble without becoming dramatically interesting about it. Just honest, used, with a jaw set like it was accustomed to being set. He was looking at Silas's back through the window of the general store. "You all right?" he said, not looking at her when he said it, still looking at the store. She should have said yes. She always said yes. She said, "I'm fine," because that was the word her mouth formed automatically. "Uh-huh," the man said, in the tone of someone who has heard that word used in that particular way before and doesn't believe it. He looked at her then. His eyes were a dark brownish gray, and they were calm in the way that isn't comfortable, the way that means the person behind them has already considered all the probable outcomes and decided they can live with them. "That your husband?" he said. She hesitated. "Yes." He nodded once and looked back at the store. "Been here long?" he said. "In Ash Hollow." 11 years. Something shifted in his face, not much, just a small adjustment around the eyes. "That's a long time," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." The bell above the store door rang and Silas came back out, and he stopped on the threshold when he saw the coat around Evelyn's shoulders and the man standing next to her. He came down the 2 steps to the sidewalk with the measured pace of a man who is deciding something. "That's mine," Silas said, looking at the coat. "It's mine," the man said. "I put it there." Silas looked at him properly then, sized him up the way he sized up everything, calibrating threat and dismissal, settling somewhere in between. The man was bigger than Silas, but Silas had armed men 20 feet away, and this stranger seemed to be alone. Those were the facts Silas was working with. "My wife doesn't need your coat, friend," Silas said. "She made a mistake and she's thinking about it." "She's standing in 30-degree weather in a dress," the man said. "That's not a lesson. That's just cruelty." There was a very complete silence on Main Street. The wind came through. Silas's voice dropped half a note in temperature. "You'd better think carefully about what you're about to say to me." "I'm not planning to say much," the man said. "Just this." He looked at Silas with those quiet, calibrated eyes, and his voice didn't rise, and he didn't reach for anything, just stood there with his hands at his sides. "Touch her again in a way she doesn't want to be touched, and you'll regret drawing another breath." It was the simplest possible sentence, and he said it like he was commenting on the weather. Silas went very still. He was a man who understood power, and what he was registering in this moment was that the man in front of him was not performing anything. He wasn't trying to look dangerous or sound dangerous or establish himself in front of the crowd. He was just saying the thing he meant, and that was, in Silas Crow's experience, considerably more alarming than any amount of posturing. "Do you know who I am?" Silas said. "Don't care particularly," the man said. One of Silas's men by the hitching post had come upright and taken a step forward. The man in the flannel shirt didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Silas, and something in the quality of his stillness said he knew the man had moved and had already accounted for him in whatever internal arithmetic he was running. The moment stretched. Evelyn felt it like a held breath. She had lived in this town for 11 years, and she had watched men threaten each other in the street before, the local theater of masculine grudge and territory, and it never looked like this. This looked different because the stranger wasn't in the theater at all. He was just standing in the street. Silas turned to Evelyn. "Go wait in the wagon," he said. "She can stay where she is," the man said. "She is my wife. And she has feet and can make her own decisions about where she stands." He finally glanced at Evelyn then. "You want to go to the wagon?" She stared at him. Nobody had asked her that question, not that question, not with that particular neutrality, in a very long time. "No," she said. She heard herself say it. She was slightly surprised. The man looked back at Silas. "There's your answer." His name, she learned later, was Rowan Voss. He had come to Ash Hollow for a specific reason, which had nothing to do with Evelyn Cross or Silas Crow. He'd been working as a blacksmith out of a mountain settlement called Garner's Pass, 2 days' ride northwest, a small operation he'd been building for 3 years. A forge, a small house, a handful of regular clients among the mining camps and outlying homesteads. He'd come to Ash Hollow because Briggs had the best price on iron stock in the territory, and because he'd needed to settle a debt with a man named Fletcher, who ran a tool supply out of his barn on the edge of town. He had not come looking for trouble. He had not found trouble, technically. Trouble had just been standing on the sidewalk and he had stopped. This was, Evelyn would come to understand, fairly characteristic of Rowan Voss. He didn't go looking for things, but he was constitutionally incapable of walking past them. So, after the confrontation on the sidewalk, Silas did not make another scene. He simply collected his goods, loaded the wagon, and drove home. And Evelyn sat beside him in silence the whole way. She kept the coat. She didn't know why Silas allowed it. Maybe because taking it back in front of the remaining witnesses would have felt like a concession. Maybe because he was working through his response to the stranger and didn't have attention left over for her. She sat with the unfamiliar weight of it around her shoulders and tried to understand what had just happened. She thought about it for 3 days before Silas brought it up. He did it at dinner on a Sunday, which was his preferred time for significant conversations because the ranch hands were off on Sundays, and there was no one within earshot. He sat at the head of the table and cut his meat with precise, unhurried strokes and said, without looking up, "That man made a fool of me." Evelyn said nothing. "In front of half the town," Silas said, "touching my wife, speaking to me that way." He took a bite, chewed. "You know who he is?" "No," she said. It was true then. She learned later. "I'll find out," Silas said. "I always find out." He looked up at her then. "And I want to know if you spoke to him. Before or after?" "I didn't know him," she said. "I'd never seen him before in my life." Silas studied her face the way he always studied her face, looking for the edge of the lie. She was not lying. She met his eyes because she had also learned, over 11 years, that looking away was worse. "If I find out you arranged that," he started. "I was standing in the cold because you took my shawl," she said. "That's all that happened." The air between them was dangerous for a moment. Then Silas went back to his dinner. "I want that coat returned," he said. "I don't have it. I left it in town." She had, in fact, left it on the post outside the general store, folded, with no note, because she hadn't known what else to do with it. Rowan Voss stayed in Ash Hollow for 4 more days after that first morning, longer than he'd planned. The reason, he would have said if anyone asked, was that his business with Fletcher had taken more time to resolve than expected. Fletcher was not a simple man to deal with, and the debt involved was complicated by a disagreement about quality of materials and a secondary issue involving a borrowed piece of equipment that Fletcher claimed he had returned, and Rowan knew he hadn't. It required multiple conversations spread across several days. That was the reason he stayed, if anyone asked. He also started going to the diner on Cross Street for his meals instead of eating at the boarding house, which was slightly out of his way, and the diner happened to be located directly across from Briggs's general store, which had a clear view of the wagon track that came down from the Crow Ranch. This was a coincidence. He was hungry, and the diner had decent food. He saw Evelyn twice more in those 4 days. The first time was on the second day, when she came into town for what appeared to be an errand. She was carrying a list, and went into the general store and came out with a package, and walked back to where her horse was hitched. She moved quickly, with the particular efficiency of someone on a schedule that isn't really their own schedule, and she didn't look up much. He watched her through the diner window. He didn't go across the street. The second time was on the 4th day, which he hadn't intended, and she clearly hadn't intended either. He was coming out of Fletcher's barn in the late afternoon when she came around the corner of the building from the opposite direction, and they nearly collided. She stepped back sharply, the automatic fear response that a person develops when startling easily becomes a habit, and then she recognized him, and the fear became something more complicated. He held up both hands. "Sorry, wasn't watching." She was quiet for a moment, that careful blankness coming down over her face before he watched her consciously let it go, like she'd caught herself doing it and decided not to. "You're still here," she said. "Finish up tomorrow. Heading back up to Garner's Pass." She nodded, that precise nod of someone filing information they weren't sure they needed. There was a moment where they could both have moved away, and that would have been that. "The coat?" she said. "I left it at the store. I hope that wasn't—" "Found it," he said. It's fine. I didn't know what to do with it. I figured. Another moment. The light was going, that orange-gray light of late afternoon in the mountains. She was wearing a heavier dress today and a proper coat of her own, buttoned to the throat, and she looked less like someone enduring something and more like someone who was somewhere between enduring it and being tired of doing it, which is different. He'll come after you, she said. Silas. He doesn't let things go. I know the type, Rowan said. You don't know him specifically, she said. He has arrangements with Sheriff Galt and with Whitmore, who runs the magistrate's office. If he decides to make a problem for you legally, they'll back him up. Rowan looked at her. She said it straightforwardly, no drama in it, just information she thought he should have. He found himself recalibrating something. She was underneath the practiced absence of expression, considerably more clear-eyed than she might appear. That's useful to know, he said. Thank you. She pulled her coat tighter. You shouldn't have done what you did. She stopped. It's going to make things harder for you, and it didn't really change anything. Maybe not, he said, but it wasn't right what he was doing in front of all those people. He said it without heat, just stating a thing. Couldn't walk past it. She looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that had learned to be very careful about what they let show. Then she said, Most people do. Walk past it. I know, he said. Why didn't you? He thought about it. He wasn't a man who talked much, and he'd found that when he did talk, being accurate was more important than being comfortable. Because watching someone hurt a person who can't fight back and doing nothing, that's not something I can come home from, he said. That's the honest answer. Something moved in her face. It was small and it came and went quickly, but it was there. She looked away toward the mountains, which were turning dark against the paler sky. My name is Evelyn, she said. Rowan Voss, he said. They didn't shake hands. That would have been strange, but she nodded again, differently this time, and he nodded back, and that was something. He left the next morning, as planned, at first light. He was 2 hours up the mountain trail when he stopped his horse at a switchback and looked back down at the valley. Ash Hollow was a smear of gray smoke and small buildings against the brown flatness of the plains. From up here it looked tiny, temporary, the kind of thing that might not be there in 20 years if the money moved somewhere else. Plenty of towns like it had disappeared already, their names surviving only in stories told by people who'd moved on. He sat there for a while longer than he'd intended to sit. Then he turned his horse north and kept climbing. In Ash Hollow, 3 days after Rowan Voss went back to Garner's Pass, a man named Caleb Mercer got very drunk at the saloon and said something to the bartender that he would spend the next week regretting. Caleb Mercer was 45 and had been running ranch supplies and trade goods between Ash Hollow and the outlying settlements for going on 15 years. He was not a bad man. He had done bad things, or more precisely had looked away from bad things, which in the accounting of consequences amounts to much the same. He had known for a long time about certain arrangements that Silas Crow had with Sheriff Galt and with Judge Whitmore. He had known because some of those arrangements involved his supply routes, certain goods moving through without proper documentation, certain shipments that weren't on the official ledgers, certain fees paid to certain people to make sure the territorial revenue officers never came snooping at inconvenient times. He had known, and he had kept his mouth shut because that was how you survived in Ash Hollow. But 3 days after seeing that stranger lay a coat over Evelyn Cross's shoulders and stand up to Silas Crow in front of half the town, Caleb Mercer was 3 whiskeys into a bad night, and he said to the bartender, a man named Ott, who was mostly deaf in his left ear, I got records of things that had burned this whole town down if the right person saw them. Ott's left ear was toward him. He didn't hear, but the man at the end of the bar did. So, what happened next took 2 weeks to develop, the way a fever develops, gradually and then suddenly, and then in a direction you don't expect. Silas Crow heard about Caleb's drunken statement within 24 hours. He heard because the man at the end of the bar worked for him, as several people in Ash Hollow did, in the quiet, indirect way that meant they kept Silas informed about things that were useful to him. Silas processed the information with his characteristic patience. He did not act immediately. He began instead to apply pressure in a series of small ways. A supply contract canceled here, a recommendation withdrawn there, the suggestion to the sheriff that Caleb's wagon needed a more thorough inspection the next time it came through the Ash Hollow checkpoint. Caleb noticed. Caleb was not stupid. He understood what was happening, and he understood that he had two options: recant loudly and completely, or go further down the road he'd accidentally turned onto. He lay awake for most of 4 nights thinking about it. He thought about Evelyn Cross standing on that sidewalk in the cold. He thought about the 11 years of it, which he'd known about because everyone in Ash Hollow knew about it, the way you know about a smell you've stopped noticing because you live with it every day. He thought about a man he'd never spoken to, a stranger who'd ridden down from the mountains and spent 4 days settling a debt and then ridden back up again, who had done the thing that everyone in Ash Hollow had failed to do for 11 years. Not because he was braver or better or more righteous, but just because he was the one person in that town who hadn't yet learned to look away. On the 5th morning, Caleb Mercer got up before dawn and went to his storage barn and dug up a tin box from underneath a floorboard that he'd been stepping over for 9 years. The box contained records. Ledgers copied in his own hand, dates, amounts, names, papers he'd held onto because a man in a dangerous situation knows instinctively to keep documentation, the way an animal knows to find high ground before a flood. He'd held them without knowing precisely what he was going to do with them. Now, sitting in his cold barn with the box open on his knee, he thought he was beginning to understand. The question was who he could get those records to before Silas Crow decided that canceling contracts wasn't sufficient. He needed someone outside Ash Hollow, outside Silas's reach. He thought about Rowan Voss, who he'd never met and whose name he'd only learned after the fact. He thought about a man who'd looked at Silas Crow and said, calmly and without theater, "You'll regret drawing another breath." He put the box under his coat and went back to his house and started thinking about how to send a letter to a blacksmith in Garner's Pass without Silas finding out about it. In the Crow Ranch house, in the room she had occupied for 11 years but which had never felt like hers, Evelyn Cross sat by the window in the dark after Silas had gone to sleep and looked at the mountains. She thought about what she'd said to Rowan Voss. It didn't really change anything. And she thought about whether she'd believed it when she said it. She wasn't sure she had. Something had changed on that sidewalk. She couldn't put a precise name to it, not her circumstances. Those were the same, maybe worse, because Silas was wound tight in a way she'd learned to recognize as the prelude to something. Not her situation legally or practically. She had nowhere to go and no money that was her own and a husband who had made sure of both those things methodically and over a long period of time. What had changed was something smaller and maybe more dangerous. A stranger had asked her if she wanted to go to the wagon, and she had said no, and nobody had made her. She sat with that for a long time. The mountains were invisible in the dark, just the absence of stars where they were. But she knew they were there, the way you know the shape of a familiar room even when the light is off. She'd looked at those mountains for 11 years from this window, and she had always thought of them as a wall. For the first time, she thought about what was on the other side. She didn't know yet what she was going to do about that thought. She sat by the window until the cold drove her back to bed, and she did not sleep well, and in the morning she made the coffee and built the fire and said nothing out loud. But the thought stayed. The letter took 11 days to reach Garner's Pass. That was partly because Caleb Mercer hadn't been able to send it directly. He'd given it to a homesteader named Pruitt, who was heading north to trade furs. And Pruitt had taken a longer route than expected because of ice on the upper trail, and the letter had sat for 3 days in a trading post at the base of the mountain before someone thought to ask if anybody was heading up toward the forge. It eventually reached Rowan Voss through a boy of about 14 who worked the stables at Garner's Pass and had been asked to deliver it by a miner coming down from the upper camp. Rowan read it standing in the doorway of his forge with the cold coming in around him and the fire going at his back, and he read it twice, which was not something he usually needed to do. The letter was not well written. Caleb Mercer was not a literary man, and he'd clearly written it in a state of nerves, the sentences running too long in places and too short in others, crossing back on themselves. But the content was specific. Names, dates, amounts paid, shipments moved without territorial documentation. A notation about a man named Derry who had worked for Silas Crow as a livestock hand and had raised a complaint with the sheriff's office about withheld wages 18 months ago, and whose whereabouts had been unknown to his family since the following week. A description of an arrangement between Silas, Sheriff Galt, and a man identified only as Whitmore, judge, magistrate, Caleb wasn't sure of the title, that had been in place for at least 7 years, possibly longer. At the bottom, in handwriting that had gotten smaller and more cramped as the letter went on, Caleb had written, I don't know what you're planning to do or if you're planning anything. I don't know why I'm sending this. I suppose I'm sending it because you're the one person I've seen in 10 years who looked at Silas Crow like he was just a man." Rowan folded the letter and stood in the doorway for a while, looking down the mountain toward where the valley was, invisible from this elevation, just the suggestion of lower ground through the trees. He had work he was supposed to finish. A set of hinges for the Garner's Pass Community Hall, a wagon wheel rim for a farmer named Kolb, who'd been waiting 2 weeks, a set of custom tongs he'd taken a deposit on from a mining operation near Blue Rock Creek. He had obligations and a schedule and a business he'd spent 3 years building out of a difficult piece of terrain and a lot of very long days. He went back inside and banked the forge fire down to low and started putting his tools in order. It took him most of the afternoon to get things arranged so they could wait, leaving a note for Kolb, setting the hinges just inside the door where they'd be found, returning the deposit on the tongs because the mining operation would need those by a date he couldn't commit to anymore. He packed a bag. He checked his rifle, which was a habit and not a statement of intent, or maybe it was both. He rode out before dawn the next morning with the temperature well below freezing and the trail iced over in patches and his horse picking its way down the switchbacks with the careful displeasure of an animal that knows it's doing this because a human has decided to do something inconvenient. He thought about the letter the whole way down. He thought specifically about the name Derry, a livestock hand, a complaint about wages, whereabouts unknown. That sentence had a weight to it that the other sentences didn't. Financial corruption was one thing. Missing people were another thing entirely. He arrived in Ash Hollow on a Wednesday afternoon, and this time he didn't try to be unobtrusive about it. There was no point. Silas Crow already knew his face, and the town already knew his name, passed around after the sidewalk incident, in the way that names get passed around in small settlements where nothing interesting happens very often. He tied his horse in front of the diner, went in, and ordered coffee and the daily meal, which turned out to be a reasonably good beef stew that he ate without tasting much of it, because he was thinking. The woman who ran this diner was named May, a broad-faced woman in her 50s who refilled his coffee without being asked, and didn't ask him any questions, which he appreciated. She had the quality of a person who had seen enough to have stopped being surprised by most things. After about 20 minutes, she said without preamble, "You're the one who put his coat on Evelyn Crow?" "Voss," he said. "Rowan Voss. May Aldrich." She set the coffee pot down on his table and folded her arms. "What are you doing back here?" "Business." "Uh-huh." She looked at him in the specific way of a woman who has been hearing that word used as a non-answer for many years. "Silas knows you're back. He's got people watching the road." "I expect so." "He's not a man who forgets," she said. "Or forgives, in case you were unclear on that." "I got a general sense," Rowan said. May looked at him a moment longer, something moving behind her eyes that wasn't quite decided yet. Then she picked up the coffee pot and went back to the counter and didn't say anything else, but she didn't charge him for the meal either, which he noticed. He found Caleb Mercer at his supply barn on the eastern edge of town at around 4 in the afternoon. Caleb was not what Rowan had pictured from the letter. The letter had suggested someone wound up tight and running on nerves and conviction. But the man Rowan found was sitting on a hay bale looking like he hadn't slept decently in 2 weeks, which was probably accurate, and who stood up too fast when Rowan came through the door and knocked over a bucket that clattered across the floor and made them both tense unnecessarily. "Mr. Voss," Caleb said. "Just Rowan." He looked around the barn, the stacked supplies, the smell of grain and leather and cold wood. "You sent the letter." "I did." Caleb rubbed his face with one hand. He was a lean man going to gray, with the kind of tan that comes from decades of outdoor work, and his eyes had the reddish look of someone who'd been drinking more than usual. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I came," Rowan said. "Tell me about Derry." Caleb sat back down on the hay bale heavily. His name was Walt Derry. He'd worked for Silas going on 4 years. Good hand, from what I knew of him. Last year in the fall, October, I think, he went to Galt's office and filed a formal complaint that Silas had been docking wages from the bunkhouse crew without cause, skimming money from what they were owed. He had a paper signed by 5 other ranch hands. He paused. Galt took the complaint, told him he'd look into it. And then Walt Derry wasn't at his boarding house by the end of that week. His horse was still there, His things were still there. He was just... Caleb spread his hands. Gone. And Galt said he'd looked into the complaint and couldn't substantiate it. Closed it. Nobody talked about it after that. Rowan was quiet for a moment. What happened to the 5 ranch hands who signed the paper? Caleb looked at the floor. 3 of them left Ash Hollow inside of 2 months. The other 2 are still on the Crow Ranch, and they've got the look of men who've decided something and are sticking to it. He meant the look of men who had decided to remember nothing. You have documentation of the wage theft? I have copies of the ledger pages. Silas's actual bookkeeping is kept at the ranch house, but the figures he reported to me for the supply invoices, I can show the discrepancy. It's not proof of what happened to Derry, but it's proof that Silas had reason to want him gone. Rowan nodded. He was thinking through it. Not the way a man thinks through a plan he's excited about, but the way a man thinks through something he's not going to enjoy that needs to be done anyway. The judge, he said. Whitmore. What do you know about him? He's territorial, based out of Crestline. Comes through Ash Hollow every 2 months for circuit hearings. He's been taking money from Silas for at least 6 years. I have a record of 2 payments myself that I carried as part of a cash delivery. I didn't know what they were for at the time. He stopped. Or I told myself I didn't. Where are your records? Caleb reached under the hay bale and pulled out a canvas bag that he'd apparently been keeping there for some time. The canvas dark at the corners from handling. He held it out. Rowan took it and opened it and looked at what was inside. Ledger pages. A copy of a signed agreement that used language careful enough that someone had been worried about exactly this scenario. A list of dates and amounts in Caleb's cramped handwriting with initials beside each one that weren't hard to decode. This is significant, Rowan said. I know. If Silas finds out you gave this to me, I know that too, Caleb said. He sounded tired more than frightened, which Rowan found he respected. I've been sitting on those documents for 9 years telling myself I was keeping them as insurance, but they're not insurance if you never plan to use them. They're just weight. He looked at his hands. I've been carrying weight for a long time. Rowan closed the bag. You'll need to be ready to testify. Documents alone won't be enough. Caleb was quiet for a moment that was a little longer than comfortable. Yeah, he said finally. I know that too. The question of what to do next was more complicated than it might have seemed. The obvious move, take the documents to the authorities, ran directly into the problem that the authorities in Ash Hollow were Galt, who was Silas's man, and the nearest territorial judge was Whitmore, who was apparently also Silas's man. The next level of authority was the territorial governor's office in Crestline, which was a 4-day ride under good conditions, and which had no particular reason to act quickly on the complaints of a supply trader and a blacksmith passing through. Rowan sat with this problem in his room at the boarding house that night and worked through it the way he worked through a fabrication problem, looking at what he had, what he needed, what the tolerances were, where the weak points would be. What he had? Caleb's documents, his own presence. What he needed? Someone with legal standing to challenge Whitmore's authority? Or evidence serious enough that the territorial administration would have to act even if they'd rather not. What the tolerances were. Very narrow, because Silas was already aware that Rowan was back in town, and narrow tolerance situations had a way of collapsing toward violence faster than anyone planned for. He thought about Evelyn, not as a piece of the strategy. He thought about her the way you think about a splinter you haven't been able to get out. Persistent, located, impossible to not be aware of. He thought about what Caleb had described, a systematic infrastructure of corruption that had allowed Silas to operate for over a decade without consequence, that had absorbed complaints and documentation and a missing man named Walt Derry and kept right on functioning. Evelyn had been inside that infrastructure for 11 years. She had watched it function. She knew things Caleb didn't know and couldn't know. The problem was getting to her without Silas knowing, which was not simple when Silas had people watching the road and had almost certainly told the ranch hands to report any contact between his wife and outsiders. He fell asleep sometime after midnight, still turning it over, and he woke up before dawn because someone was throwing small stones at his window. He looked out. The street was empty, the pre-dawn dark complete and thick with cold, and he almost dismissed it as his imagination or an animal until he saw the shape by the side of the livery stable across the way, not quite still enough to be a post, the slight shifting of someone trying to stand very still. He dressed, pulled on his boots, took his rifle as a precaution, and went down the back stairs and came around the side of the boarding house through the alley. The figure by the livery stable heard him coming and turned, and even in the dark he recognized her. The way she held herself, the particular set of her shoulders that he'd catalogued on the sidewalk 2 weeks ago. Evelyn Cross had walked 2 miles in the dark on frozen ground in a coat that wasn't warm enough for the weather. "You're back," she said, quiet and direct. No preamble. "You walked here," he said. "Silas takes the horses." She said it flatly, not complaining, just explaining the logistics. "I waited until after midnight. He drinks on Tuesdays." "It's Wednesday." "I know what day it is." She looked at him with those careful eyes. "I heard you were in town. May told me. She comes out to the ranch to deliver bread on Wednesdays. She comes early. She said you were at the diner." She paused. "She said she thought you were going to do something stupid, and she wanted me to know in case it mattered." Rowan looked at her for a moment. "What do you think I'm doing?" "I think you got Caleb's letter," she said. "He told me he sent one. He came out to the ranch 2 weeks ago to deliver some supplies, and he told me, that was a risk for him, telling me." Something shifted in her expression, a small acknowledgement. "I didn't know he had those records. I knew about some of the arrangements with Galt, and I knew about Whitmore, but I didn't know Caleb had documentation." Rowan was quiet for a moment, working through what she'd just told him. "How much do you know?" "More than I should," she said. 11 years in a house with a man like Silas, you hear things. He doesn't think about what you're hearing because he doesn't really think of you as a person who would do anything with it." There was no particular bitterness in how she said it, just accuracy. "I know about the arrangement with the territorial revenue officers. I know about a shipment that came through in the spring of last year that wasn't livestock. I know about Walt Dairy." Rowan went still. "What do you know about Dairy?" Evelyn looked at him steadily. Her voice was very level. "I know he didn't leave town on his own. The cold between them was not just the weather." "Can you prove any of it?" Rowan said. "Some of it. There are papers in Silas's office. He keeps a lockbox in the bottom left drawer of his desk. I've seen the key. I know where he keeps it." She paused. "I haven't taken anything from that box because until 2 weeks ago I didn't see the point. There's no authority in this town that would act on it. There's the territorial governor's office. That's 4 days away and requires getting out of Ash Hollow without Silas stopping me, which is not simple." Her voice was still level, but something underneath it had tightened. "He's not going to just watch me walk out the door." Rowan looked at her for a long moment. The darkness was beginning to thin at the edges. Not dawn yet, but the first suggestion of it. She had walked 2 miles in the dark because she had information, and she'd decided to use it, and she'd done it alone. And he thought about what 11 years of living carefully must have done to someone who was, underneath all that careful survival, this direct. "If you could get those papers," he said, "and get to me, I can get you out of Ash Hollow, up to Garner's Pass. Silas's reach doesn't extend that far into the mountains. And then? And then we put together what you have and what Caleb has, and we find someone in the territorial administration who isn't on Silas's payroll, and we take it to them. It'll take time." "How much time?" "I don't know," he said. "Honest answer. I don't know how far up this goes." She looked away toward the mountains that were still invisible in the dark. Her breath came out white in the cold air. She was quiet for long enough that he started to think she'd decided against it. "My mother used to say that waiting for a safer moment is how you wait forever," she said, not quite to him, more like saying it to the air to see how it sounded. Then she looked back. "I need 2 days to get the papers without him noticing, and to wait for a morning when he goes to the South Range. He goes every second Thursday to check the fence lines. This Thursday is the second one." "Thursday," Rowan said. "Before dawn. You have somewhere you can meet me outside town?" She thought for a moment. "There's a dry creek bed about half a mile east, off the Garner's Pass Road. There's a collapsed cottonwood across it. You'll see it. I'll be there by 4. "I'll be there," he said. She nodded. She was already pulling her coat tighter, preparing to go, the way a person does when they've completed the thing they came to do and need to get back before they're missed. Then she stopped. "What's the plan if it doesn't work?" she said. It was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer. "I don't know," he said. I'm working on having enough pieces in place that it does work. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. She looked at him. That flat, calm look that he was starting to understand was not absence of emotion, but the very practiced management of it. And then she said, "All right," and walked back into the dark. He stood by the livery stable and watched until he couldn't see her anymore, and then he went back inside and didn't sleep. The next 2 days were quiet, in the way that a thing is quiet when it's building towards something. Rowan stayed visible, had his meals at the diner, went to Briggs's store for some supplies he didn't strictly need, let himself be seen going about ordinary business. He was aware of being watched. It was the kind of awareness that comes from experience in situations where awareness is practical rather than paranoid. He saw one of Silas's men, a heavy-set fellow with a scarred chin who'd been leaning against the saloon wall during the sidewalk confrontation, make a point of being wherever Rowan was for about half a day before apparently deciding that nothing interesting was happening. He spoke to Caleb once more, briefly, in the barn, confirming what they'd discussed, going over the documents again more carefully, making notes about the sequence they'd need to establish for any official inquiry. Caleb had stopped drinking, or at least significantly reduced it, which Rowan took as a good sign. The man was scared, but he was functioning. "He's going to find out," Caleb said, near the end of their second meeting. "Yes," Rowan agreed. "And when he does, we need enough already in motion that finding out doesn't change the outcome." He looked at Caleb. "You have to be able to hold. When it gets loud and it starts to feel like it's falling apart, you have to hold." Caleb was quiet. "I should have done this years ago." "Maybe," Rowan said. "Doesn't matter now." "It matters to Walt Derry," Caleb said. Rowan didn't answer that because it was true, and there wasn't anything useful to say about it. Thursday came in gray and very cold, the kind of cold that comes in the week before a proper snowstorm, the air heavy and still and smelling of iron. Rowan was at the collapsed cottonwood by the dry creek bed at 3:30, an hour before he needed to be, not because he was nervous, but because being early was a habit of his that he'd never bothered to break. He tied his horse in the cottonwood's branches. It was a big tree. The fall had opened up a wide space of root and trunk, and waited. She was there by 5 minutes to 4, which meant she'd been moving through the dark for well over an hour. She was carrying a canvas satchel over one shoulder and had a bedroll tied across her back, which told him she'd packed for more than a day trip. She was wearing better boots than he'd seen her in before, heavy, lace-up work boots. And she had a scarf wrapped around her head and neck against the cold. She stopped when she saw him, confirming it was him, and then came forward. "He left at 2, she said. "The South Range is further than I told him. I've been adjusting the fence line reports for 6 months, so he'd think the south boundary was further out. Buys me a few extra hours." Rowan looked at her. She said it matter-of-factly, like this was just practical information, which it was. But it also told him something about the kind of thinking that had been happening behind those careful eyes over the past weeks. Deliberate, patient, working around the problem she couldn't go through directly. "The papers?" he said. She opened the satchel and showed him. There were more documents than he'd expected. Not just a few pages, but a significant collection. Some of them clearly photographed copies made with the kind of careful hand transcription that suggested she'd been doing this over time, not just in the past 2 days. "How long have you been collecting these?" he said. 3 years, she said. He looked at her. "I told you I didn't see the point," she said. "I still thought that, but I also thought, just in case there was ever a point, I should be ready." She closed the satchel. "I just needed someone to show me what the point looked like." Rowan understood, then, that she had been making this particular preparation long before he'd come to Ash Hollow. She had been waiting, not passively, but actively, building a case in the dark against a future she hadn't been sure would ever arrive. The stranger on the sidewalk hadn't created her. He'd just changed her calculation about timing. That understanding settled something in him that he hadn't known was unsettled. "We should move," he said. "You have a horse?" "Silas's second mare. She's slow, but she's quiet." She nodded back toward the creek. "I tied her a 1/4 mile east." They moved quickly and without much talking, which was right for the situation. The light was still very thin when they reached her horse, and they were on the Garner's Pass road within the half hour, moving north and uphill as the sky began, gradually, to go from black to gray. It was a long ride, better than 6 hours at the pace they could manage on trails that were frozen and in some places treacherous. And they didn't talk much for the first couple of hours. There was too much to watch on the trail and too much happening in both their heads. And besides, conversation felt premature, like discussing the outcome before you've done the work. Around mid-morning, when the sun had finally gotten above the eastern ridge and the trail had widened enough that they could ride side by side, Evelyn said, "Tell me about Garner's Pass." He told her. Small, maybe 40 people, mostly miners and their families, some homesteaders in the lower valley, a trading post, the forge. It was not glamorous. It was cold and the supply lines were uncertain and the winters were genuinely hard. He said all of this without apology because it was just the truth of the place. "Is there work?" she said. He glanced at her. The question was practical, not rhetorical. "There's always work in a mining settlement," he said. "More than there are people to do it. You know any skills?"
"I can cook," she said. "Well, actually, not just adequately. I mean, I can run a kitchen properly. I did it at my mother's house before I was married, and I've done it at the ranch for 11 years. I can do books. I can read and write better than most people in Ash Hollow. I sew, though I don't love it." She considered. "I know a fair amount about cattle management, which is probably not useful in a mining settlement." "Mining operations need books kept," he said. "I imagined they might."
They rode for a while in a silence that had shifted quality from the silence of an hour ago. Less tense, more thinking. "This might not work," she said. Not fearfully, just stating a possibility. "It might not," he agreed, "if Silas gets to the right people before we do." "Then we go higher," Rowan said. "There are people above Whitmore. There are people above them. And we have documentation that, at a certain level of the territorial administration, is going to be embarrassing enough that someone is going to want to get ahead of it." "You sound very certain." "I'm not certain," he said, "but I found that going forward like you are usually gets you further than going forward like you might not, and the odds aren't different either way." She thought about that for a moment. "That's either very wise or very simple." "Probably simple," he said. The trace of something almost like a smile crossed her face. It was the first time he'd seen anything close to it, and it was gone quickly, the way a bird crosses a window. But it had been there. They were 3 hours out of Garner's Pass when they heard the riders behind them. It was Rowan who heard it first. The sound of shod hooves on frozen ground, moving fast, more than 2 horses. He pulled up and turned, and Evelyn pulled up beside him, and they both listened. "How many?" she said. 4, maybe 5. He was looking back down the trail. "Moving hard. They know this road." He looked at her. "Does Silas know this route?" "He knows every route in this territory," she said. Her voice had gone flat and calm again. "He has men who've ridden these mountains for years." Rowan calculated. They had maybe 15 minutes, probably less. The trail ahead narrowed before opening up into the approach to Garner's Pass. There was a section through the upper canyon that was single file and slow, and that was where they'd be most vulnerable. He looked at the terrain around them. He had an advantage the riders behind them didn't. He had been riding this trail for 3 years, and he knew the deviation points. "There's a mining track that splits off about a mile ahead," he said. "Goes up through the eastern face to the Blue Rock Creek operation. It's rough, but passable. It rejoins the main trail above the canyon." "You know it?" "Well enough." He was already moving, pushing his horse to a faster pace. "Stay close." She pushed her mare up beside him without question, and they rode hard into the narrow trees with the sound of the riders behind them growing steadily louder in the cold mountain air, and the sky above the ridgeline was a flat iron gray that said the storm. The old-timers had been predicting, had finally decided to arrive. Rowan didn't look back. Looking back was for when you had time to spare and they didn't have time to spare. He thought about Caleb back in Ash Hollow with his canvas bag of documents, alone and waiting, and he thought about the long argument ahead of them. Not a fight in the street, not a single confrontation, but the grinding, uncertain, unglamorous work of taking a case piece by piece to people who had reason not to hear it, in a territory where the law had been someone else's property for long enough that prying it loose was going to take everything they had, and probably more. He thought about what Evelyn had said. "I just needed someone to show me what the point looked like." He kept riding. The mining track was worse than Rowan remembered. It had been late summer the last time he'd ridden it. and summer had a way of making terrain feel manageable that winter stripped away entirely. The track climbed the eastern face of the ridge through a series of switchbacks that were narrow even in good conditions, and the frost had gotten into the rock over the past weeks and heaved sections of the path out of true, leaving sudden drops and loose shelves of stone that the horses had to be talked across one careful step at a time. The trees closed in overhead and blocked most of what light the gray sky was offering, and the temperature dropped sharply as they gained elevation, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in your clothing and settles there. Evelyn didn't complain. She didn't say anything that wasn't necessary, which Rowan appreciated because unnecessary words on a trail like this were a distraction. She handled her mare with more competence than he'd expected, not expertly, but practically, giving the animal room to make its own decisions on the uncertain ground instead of fighting it, which was the right instinct. He'd half expected to have to slow down for her. He didn't. The sound of riders behind them faded within the first 20 minutes, which meant they'd taken the main trail and hadn't found the deviation point, or they'd found it and decided against it. Either way, it bought time. It did not buy certainty, which was a different thing. They came out above the canyon after nearly 2 hours of hard climbing, onto a wider ledge where the trees thinned and you could see back down the valley. The storm the sky had been promising all morning had started arriving in earnest. Not snow yet, but the solid gray ceiling had dropped, and the wind had picked up, and the air smelled like it meant it this time. Rowan pulled up and looked back. The trail below was empty as far as he could see, which wasn't as far as he'd like. "They'll go back to Silas," Evelyn said, pulling her mare up beside him. She was breathing hard from the climb, her cheeks red. "Report where we went. He'll send more men." "More men will have the same terrain problem," Rowan said. "He has men who know these mountains better than that track," she said. "Hendricks, his head hand. He's been through this country for 20 years. He'll know the way around." Rowan thought about that. How long? She looked at the sky, calculating. If they turn back now and get to Silas by evening, and he sends Hendricks out tonight, maybe by morning they're above us. Then we don't sleep long. He started moving again toward Garner's Pass, still 2 hours out. She fell in beside him on the wider track. Neither of them said anything for a while. The wind came through the trees in long, cold pulls. "You should know," she said eventually, "that Silas won't just send men to bring me back. He'll send men to deal with you." I figured. I mean, specifically, he'll have told Galt you're a threat. He can frame whatever happens to you as a legal matter. Resisting arrest, assault on a peace officer, anything that needs framing. Her voice was steady and informational, the same quality it had when she'd explained about the fence reports. She delivered hard facts the way some people delivered weather reports, because the information was what it was, and stating it clearly was more useful than flinching at it. "I want you to understand what you're in the middle of." Rowan looked at her sideways. "Appreciate it," he said. Understood it mostly. "Good to have the specifics." She nodded. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm not particularly worried about Galt. He's the law." "He's wearing a badge," Rowan said. "That's not the same thing." Garner's Pass in late October had the look of a place that had committed to winter and was getting on with it. The main track through the settlement was packed ice over mud, and the few buildings, the trading post, the boarding house that doubled as a community hall, 4 or 5 cabin-style homes, the small cluster of miners' quarters near the creek, had all acquired their seasonal layer of wood smoke residue on the north-facing walls, the dark staining that came from months of fire burning against months of cold. The forge was at the far end of the settlement, built slightly apart from the other structures in the practical way of things that occasionally caught fire and that you didn't want catching fire near other things. Rowan had built it 3 years ago from a combination of salvaged stone and new timber, and it was solid and well-designed, which was about the most you could say for something you'd built yourself without help and under the kind of budget constraints that require creativity. He put Evelyn in the back room of the forge, which he used as a combination storage and occasional sleeping space during the weeks he worked too long to bother going home. There was a cot, a small stove, a window that faced east. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was warm, and it was out of the weather, and nobody was going to come looking for her there without first coming through him. She sat on the cot and looked around the room with the expression of someone taking honest inventory of a situation. "This is fine," she said, and meant it. He made coffee on the small stove, which took longer than he wanted because the temperature had done something to the fuel, and he brought her a cup and sat in the one chair the room offered, and they went through the documents together. She had more than he'd realized. In addition to the papers from Silas's lockbox, which included what appeared to be a copy of a private agreement with Whitmore, the territorial judge, regarding favorable rulings on land boundary disputes in exchange for payments he'd been receiving twice yearly. She had her own records. 3 years of observations, dates and times, and summaries of conversations she'd overheard, all written in a small, very precise hand on the backs of household supply lists so they'd look like nothing if found. Pages of it. The patience and detail of it was something Rowan sat with for a long moment before he was able to continue reading. "The agreement with Whitmore," he said. "This is a copy?" "I copied it by hand from the original. It took me most of a night." She drank her coffee. "The original is in the lockbox, which is now locked, and I don't have the key, but the original is there. If this copy can be verified against the original, it's word for word. I was careful." He believed her. The document had the dense, convoluted syntax of something a lawyer had written to be legally defensible while also being hard to understand, and she had reproduced it precisely, including what looked like an error in the numbering of clauses. "The problem," he said, "is still Whitmore himself. He's the circuit judge for this territory. Any case that goes through official channels in this county goes through him." "Or around him," she said. He looked up. "There's a federal marshal's office," she said, "in Delwater, which is east, not 4 days east like Crestline, more like 6 days, but Delwater isn't in Whitmore's circuit, and federal jurisdiction supersedes territorial. If we can get this to a federal marshal, you know this. I've had 3 years to read every piece of legal documentation I could get my hands on without Silas noticing," she said. "I learned what I needed to learn." Rowan sat back. "That's the play, then." "I think it is. But Delwater is 6 days east, and getting there means going back through the valley, which means going through Ash Hollow or around it, and either way, Silas will be ahead of us," Rowan finished. He thought about it. "We need to send the documents ahead, someone we can trust to carry them to Delwater directly." "Is there anyone here you trust that much?" He thought about the people in Garner's Pass. The mining operation was run by a man named Creston, who was reliable in the specific way of men who have financial interests in reliability. The trader was too connected to the commercial routes that ran through Ash Hollow. There was a homesteader named Alderman, a family man, solid, but Rowan wouldn't ask a family man for something that might put him in Silas Crow's path. "There's a man named Taggart," he said. "He works the upper camp. No family, no commercial ties through the valley. He's done courier runs for the mining operation before." He stood up. "I'll find him tonight." "Tonight? If Hendricks is moving in the dark, I'd rather have the documents moving in the dark too." She didn't argue with the logic. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at the small window where the darkness outside was complete, and the wind had started pushing against the glass in small testing gusts. "And while the documents are moving," she started. "We stay here," he said. "We make Silas come to us on ground he doesn't know well. And when he comes, then we deal with that." She looked at him, and there was something in her expression, not fear exactly, more like the look of someone who has made a decision they know is irreversible and is sitting with the full weight of that. "You should know that I'm not going back," she said. "No matter what happens, if it goes wrong, I'm not going back to that house." "I know," he said. "I mean it plainly. I'm telling you so you don't make decisions on the assumption that returning me to Silas is an acceptable outcome under any conditions." "Understood," Rowan said, equally plain. "It's not." Something in her released, very slightly. Not dramatically, just a small adjustment, like a knot that's been pulled tight for so long you forget it's there, and then it gives just a fraction, and you notice the difference. She looked back at the window. "All right," she said. "Find your man Taggart." Trick. Taggart was awake when Rowan knocked, which surprised him, but the man had the permanent semi-alert state of someone who spends months at a time in remote camps where things can go wrong in the night. He was about 50, compact and leathery, with a neatly clipped white beard and the eyes of a man who kept his opinions to himself. He listened to Rowan's explanation without interruption, asked 2 precise questions about the route and the risk, and then said, "I'll want $50 when I get back." "Mm-mm." "40 when you leave," Rowan said. "20 more when you're back." "That's 60. For 6 days in federal government business, 60 is fair." Taggart thought about it. "When do I leave?" "Now." Another brief pause. "Coffee first." He was on the East Trail within 40 minutes, the documents in a sealed oilskin pouch inside his coat, the names and location of the federal marshal's office in Delwater written on a separate sheet of paper in Rowan's hand. Rowan watched him go and stood in the cold for a moment after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, and he thought about probability. The probability that Taggart made it to Delwater and back without incident was reasonable. The probability that the federal marshal's office acted quickly on documents delivered by a stranger was less certain. The probability that they had enough time to get any of that to matter before Silas arrived in Garner's Pass. That was the problem he couldn't solve from this end. He went back to the forge and added wood to the main fire and sat in the chair that was too short for him and eventually slept, poorly, for a few hours. Silas's men arrived on the second morning. There were 6 of them, which was more than Rowan had expected and which told him something about how Silas was reading the situation. 6 men sent to a mountain settlement of 40 people was not subtlety. It was a demonstration. Silas was saying, "I reach here too." Rowan was at the forge when they rode in. He heard them from the ring of hooves on the frozen track and put down his tongs and came out to the front of the forge and stood there with his leather apron on and his hands at his sides and watched them come. Hendricks was at the front, a big man on a big horse, with a face like a worked piece of granite and the kind of calm that belonged to someone who'd done this type of errand before. He had a deputy's badge pinned to his coat, which was new information, and told Rowan that Galt had deputized him, which gave the whole business a legal coding that was going to be complicated to argue against in the moment. The other 5 spread out in the practiced way of men who have done this enough times to do it automatically. 2 came around Rowan's left, 2 to the right, 1 stayed back by the horses. They had rifles, but none of them were raised yet. "Rowan Voss," Hendricks said. "That's me. I've got a warrant for your arrest, issued by Sheriff Galt of Ash Hollow, supported by order of Territorial Judge Whitmore." He reached into his coat and produced a paper, which he held up without coming closer. "Charge is abduction and interference with a man's legal property." A woman, Rowan understood, was the legal property in question. He kept his face level. "Let me see the warrant," he said. Hendricks rode forward and leaned down and handed it to him. Rowan looked at it. It was a real document, properly formatted, with Galt's signature and Whitmore's seal. Whatever its moral standing, its legal surface was intact. "Where's Mrs. Crow?" Hendricks said. "Don't know what you're referring to," Rowan said. "She left the ranch Thursday morning. She's a married woman under her husband's care, and she's required by law to return. You're required by law to facilitate that return." "Legally," Rowan said, "I've been here in Garner's Pass minding my forge. I'm not aware that I'm holding anyone." The people of Garner's Pass had been filtering out of their homes and the trading post at the sound of horses, which was the natural behavior of a small settlement when something unusual happens. There were maybe 15, 20 people within earshot now, which was most of Garner's Pass. They stood at the edges of the scene in the way of people who are not sure yet whether to be witnesses or participants. Hendricks looked at Rowan steadily. He was not a stupid man, and he knew a constructed answer when he heard one. "I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want a straight answer," he said. "Is Evelyn Crow here?" From behind Rowan, from the direction of the forge door, Evelyn's voice said, "I'm here." Rowan did not turn around because he'd heard her footsteps and he knew where she was, but he felt something tighten in his jaw. He'd told her to stay in the back room. He had told her specifically. She came to stand beside him, not behind him, and she was wearing her coat and her good boots and carrying the canvas satchel over one shoulder with the kind of deliberateness that said she had decided something and had decided it clearly. "Mrs. Crow," Hendricks said, and there was something in his voice that might have been something like relief, or might have been the anticipation of this being over. "My name is Evelyn Cross," she said. "I took my husband's name when I married him, but I've decided to stop using it." A few of the Garner's Pass people shifted. Hendricks kept his composure. "Ma'am, I have an order requiring your return to your husband's custody." I'm aware of what you have, she said. I'd like to see it. He hesitated, then produced another document. A copy, it appeared, of the same order, and she took it and read it. She read it carefully, all the way through, which took longer than Hendricks was comfortable with, based on the way he adjusted in his saddle. This order, she said, is signed by Judge Whitmore. That's correct. I have here. She opened the satchel and took out the copy of the private agreement. A document that records a financial arrangement between my husband and Judge Whitmore extending back 6 years. Payments in exchange for favorable rulings. She held it up, which would indicate that Judge Whitmore's order in this matter is not impartial and is therefore legally contestable. Hendricks looked in the paper without reaching for it. Something had shifted in his expression. Not the document itself, but what the document represented, which was a complication that went beyond the simple errand he'd been sent on. One of the Garner's Pass people, Creston, the mining operator, who had more legal education than anyone else in the settlement, said from the edge of the group, "She's got a point about judicial impartiality. That's a standing legal challenge." Hendricks looked at Creston. Then he looked at Evelyn. Then he looked at Rowan. "This doesn't change the warrant," he said, but there was less certainty in it than there'd been. "No," Rowan agreed, "but it changes what happens when she contests it, and she's going to contest it." He kept his voice level. No heat, just information. "You take her back to Ash Hollow, and she contests it, and those documents go with her and become part of the official record. And then the question of Whitmore's impartiality becomes a question everyone has to answer." He looked at Hendricks with the same calm he'd used on Silas's sidewalk. "Or you go back to Silas and tell him the situation is more complicated than he sent you to resolve, and you let the people who have legal standing to sort this out, sort it out." The 6 men had not moved. The 2 on Rowan's left were watching him with the attention of men waiting for a reason to act. The one by the horses had his hand near his rifle without touching it. Hendricks was quiet for a long moment. He was doing the arithmetic of the situation. His orders, the warrant, the legal challenge, the 20 witnesses from Garner's Pass who were watching all of this, the documents the woman was holding, and whatever his own sense of the thing was telling him privately. "I'll need to report this to Mr. Crow," he said finally. "That's your business," Rowan said. Hendricks looked at Evelyn one more time. "I'll be back, ma'am," with clear instructions. "I'll be here," she said. He pulled his horse around and the 5 men followed, and Garner's Pass watched them ride back down the east trail until they were out of sight, and then everybody stood around in the cold for a moment, not quite sure what had just happened. Creston walked over. He was a wiry, sharp-faced man in his 60s with the look of someone who had spent a very long career turning difficult situations into acceptable outcomes. "That's a temporary solution," he said. "He's going to go back and Crow is going to send more men or come himself or find another legal instrument to work with." "I know," Rowan said. "What's the actual play here?" Rowan looked at him. "I sent documents to the federal marshal's office in Delwater 4 days ago. I'm waiting on a response." Creston raised his eyebrows. "Federal, that's a long reach." "Whitmore's circuit doesn't extend to federal jurisdiction," Evelyn said, "and the documents include evidence of bribery of a territorial official, which is a federal offense." Creston absorbed this. He looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of someone recalibrating an assessment. "You've been working on this a while," he said. 3 years, she said. He nodded slowly. "How long do you need?" "As long as it doesn't fall apart," Rowan said. "Helpful," Creston said dryly. Then, "I'll put 2 men on the approach trail. They'll tell us when someone's coming." Evelyn was furious with herself for about an hour after Hendricks left. She sat in the back room of the forge and went through the conversation in her head, looking for what she'd done wrong, which was a habit she'd developed over 11 years of having to be right about everything because being wrong had consequences. She'd stepped out when Rowan had told her to stay. She'd done it because she'd heard the conversation from the back room, and she'd understood that staying hidden would only delay the confrontation and put Rowan in the position of lying outright on her behalf, which created a different kind of legal problem. Her instinct had been correct, she thought, but the execution had been impulsive, and she didn't like impulsive. Impulsive had gotten her into situations before. The thing was, she had stood there. She had stood next to him, and not behind him, and she'd held up a document and spoken to an armed man, and nobody had made her stop. She was still thinking about that when Rowan came back inside. He He looked at her. "You told me to stay in the back," she said. "I did," he agreed. "You're angry."
"I was for about 30 seconds, he said. "Then I thought about what would have happened if you hadn't come out. Hendricks would have turned the settlement over until he found you, and then the document doesn't get produced in front of 20 witnesses, and it's just his word against mine." He sat down in the short chair. "You made the right call. I just hadn't thought it through to that point yet." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me I should have done what I was told."
"No," he said. "You're not a person who does things because they're told to. You make decisions, sometimes better ones than me." He said it without any particular emphasis, just noting a fact. I'd rather account for that than pretend it's not true. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up properly and was making a sound in the eaves that meant the storm had arrived for real. "He'll come himself," she said. "Silas. He won't leave this to Hendricks, and he won't leave it to Galt. It's too personal now." "When do you think?" She thought about Silas's patterns, how he moved when something had gotten under his skin, the particular quality of his anger when he felt humiliated, which was what this was. This was humiliation more than anything else. 4 days, maybe 5. He'll put the ranch in order first. He doesn't go anywhere without putting things in order. 4 or 5 days. Taggart had been gone 4. The round trip to Delwater, if everything went without delay, which it wouldn't because nothing ever went without delay, was 12 days minimum. "We need to give Caleb a way to act," she said. "He's in Ash Hollow with his documents and no protection, and if Silas leaves for here, then there's no one between Caleb and whatever Silas decides to do about him before he rides out," Rowan finished. He'd thought about this. He hadn't thought of a solution yet, which was the problem. "Can you get a message to him?" "Not fast enough," he said. "Not through any channel that doesn't go through Ash Hollow first." She stood up and moved to the window. The snow had started, small and hard-driven, clicking against the glass. She watched it for a moment with the focused look of someone thinking hard about something they haven't quite reached yet. "May," she said, "the woman from the diner? She goes to the ranch every Wednesday with bread. I've been—" She stopped. "May and I have been careful with each other for years. She's never directly intervened, but she's never been nothing either. She came to the ranch to tell me you were back. She didn't have to do that." She turned from the window. "She's connected. She knows everyone in Ash Hollow, and she's trusted in a way that I'm not, and that Caleb right now probably isn't. If I could get a message to her—" "Telling her what?" Evelyn thought carefully. "Telling her to go to Caleb and tell him to get the document somewhere safe and stay visible. Don't hide, don't run. That looks like guilt. Stay exactly where he is and let people see him. If Silas tries to move against him openly, witnesses matter." It was the right strategy. Rowan saw it immediately. Keeping Caleb where people could see him, making any action against him public rather than private, was the kind of protection that didn't require legal standing because it used social standing instead. "I can get someone to carry a message to May," he said. "Creston's men know the valley routes." "Tonight," she said. "If Silas is already preparing to leave." "Tonight," he agreed. The next 3 days were a particular kind of difficult that doesn't announce itself loudly. It was the waiting, the cold, the small, tight space of the forge and the back room, and the few paths between the buildings that they could take without going near the settlement's edges, where Creston's watchmen were posted. It was Evelyn reading and rereading her documents at the small table by the window, looking for anything she'd missed or misread. It was Rowan at the forge working, because work was how he managed the kind of tension that had no immediate outlet, and because the sound of the hammer was, he suspected, also reassuring to the people of Garner's Pass who needed to hear ordinary things happening. They talked during those 3 days more than they'd talked before. It started practically, going over the documents again, discussing the legal arguments, accounting for what Whitmore might do if challenged directly, whether Galt would act without Silas present to direct him. But conversations have a way of moving, especially in confined spaces with long, quiet stretches, and by the second day they were talking about other things. She told him about her mother, a woman named Clara, practical and funny in the dry way of people who have had to be very practical for a long time, who had come west with nothing and built something modest and held it together by sheer refusal to let it fall. She said her mother had always talked about the mountains as the place where things were true, which she'd thought was poetic when she was young and now thought was just accurate. He told her about the burn scar on his left hand, which had come from a mistake he'd made in his second year of smithing. Too much confidence about where the metal would go and not enough respect for the heat. And he'd been lucky it was his hand and not his face. He'd been apprenticed to a man in eastern Ohio who had about 12 words in his vocabulary, and 4 of them were variants of think first, which had eventually become the principle Rowan organized most of his life around, somewhat too late in the case of his hand. She laughed at the story, the real laugh, which he hadn't heard before, which was shorter and more abrupt than people might have expected, gone almost as soon as it arrived. "That's the look of someone who finds that surprising," she said. "What?" "You, when I laughed. You look surprised." He thought about whether to say the straightforward thing and decided that straightforward was what had been working between them. "Didn't think you had a lot of practice at it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I don't, particularly." And then, after a pause, "It's easier here." He didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't either overstate or understate what she meant. And he'd learned enough about Evelyn Cross in the past weeks to know that she said exactly what she meant and didn't need it repeated back at her. Outside, the snow had settled into a steady, determined fall that had laid 8 inches down in 3 days and was clearly not finished. On the 4th day, Creston's man came down from the approach trail at mid-morning and found Rowan at the forge. "Someone coming," he said. "Not 6 this time. More like 20. Rowan put down his work. "Silas?" he said. "One man in front on a gray horse. Good clothes," the man said. "Also a man with a badge. Looks like Galt himself, not a deputy. And—" he paused, and something in the pause was different. "There's a 3rd man with them. Not ranch hands. Dressed like town. Fancy coat." Rowan thought about that. A man in a fancy coat who wasn't ranch hands and wasn't Galt. "Whitmore," Evelyn said from the doorway. She'd heard. Her face had gone very still. "The judge is coming himself," Rowan said. "Of course he is," she said. "Silas would have told him what I have. He couldn't risk leaving it to anyone else to contain." She stepped inside, and there was something different in how she was standing, something that had resolved and settled in the past 4 days coming fully into shape. 20 men, Galt, Whitmore, and Silas, in a settlement of 40 people. She looked at Rowan, and her voice was steady in the way it had been on the sidewalk in Ash Hollow, in front of the whole town, standing in the cold in a dress. Steady, not because nothing was at stake, but because things being at stake had stopped being a reason to fold. "I'm not waiting in the back room," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "What do we have?" He thought about it honestly, was what they actually had, not what they wished they had. Creston and maybe 10 men of Garner's Pass who were inclined to be witnesses or more. The documents. Evelyn's testimony. Caleb, somewhere in Ash Hollow, with his own records and hopefully still standing. And Taggart, somewhere on a mountain road between here and Delwater, carrying an oilskin pouch, with no way to know how far he'd gotten. "We have enough to make it loud," he said. "Loud enough that whatever happens here, people know." "That's what we had before," she said. "Yeah," he said. "But before, we were going to them. Now they're coming to us. And 20 men and a judge riding into a settlement with women and children and minors who have done nothing wrong." He looked at her. "That's a different picture than an arrest warrant." She understood immediately what he meant. 20 men and a corrupt judge and a man like Silas, descending on a settlement that had done nothing except offer 2 people a place to stand. That was overreach visible to anyone watching. And the people of Garner's Pass were watching. She pulled on her coat. She picked up the satchel with the documents. She walked to the door of the forge and stopped and looked back at him with those careful dark eyes. And in them he could see what this cost. Not fear, she had moved past fear, but the full understanding of what they were about to walk into. "I want to go back," she said. He looked at her. "To Ash Hollow," she clarified. "I want to be there when it comes apart. I don't want to hear about it afterward from the mountains." She paused. "If Caleb is going to do what he said he'd do, put the evidence in front of the people, then I should be there. I should be the one to stand up and say what I know." Rowan thought about this. He thought about 20 men and a judge coming up the trail and what would happen if they arrived and found them already gone, down the west trail, through the back country, toward Ash Hollow on a different road. "You understand what going back means," he said. "Yes," she said. "I go back on my own terms, with evidence, with witnesses, and I say what happened to me and what I know, and I say it in front of whoever will hear it. Or," she stopped, "or I spend the rest of my life in a mountain settlement looking over my shoulder for Silas's next move." Rowan looked at her for a long moment. She was right. She had been right about most things, and she was right about this. The move that felt most dangerous was also the only one that could end this completely, instead of just delaying it. "The west trail goes down the back of the ridge," he said. "It comes out into the valley about 8 miles north of Ash Hollow." "I know it," she said. "We leave now before they're at the top of the approach trail. We have 4 hours on them." "Then we should go," she said. He got his horse and she got hers, and they went out the back of the forge compound, and Creston was there, having understood what was happening, and he stood in the snow with his arms folded. "Tell them," Rowan said to him, "that we went to Ash Hollow. Tell them where and why. Make them hear it in front of everyone here." Creston nodded. "You better be right about this," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm not sure I am," Rowan said honestly, "but I'm sure it's the right move." Creston looked at Evelyn. She met his eyes without flinching. "All right," he said, and stepped aside. They rode out through the back of Garner's Pass into the snow, which was still falling in the same steady, unhurried way, covering the tracks almost as soon as they made them, and the mountains closed in around them, and somewhere behind them, on the approach trail, 20 men were climbing toward a settlement that would be ready and watching when they arrived. The west trail off the back of Garner's Pass Ridge was not a trail in any formal sense. It was a line of least resistance through the mountain terrain, a route that existed because animals and occasional desperate men had used it enough times over enough years to wear something approximating a path into the rock and soil. In summer, it was passable with care. In October, with 8 inches of new snow on the ground and more coming down, it was the kind of route that required you to commit to it fully, because there was no good place to turn around once you were on it. Rowan had ridden it 4 times. He knew where the loose sections were, where the drop-offs came closer to the trail than they appeared, where a horse could be trusted to make its own decision and where it needed to be led. He went first and Evelyn followed, her mare picking up the pattern quickly, and they moved through the snow and the silence of the upper mountain in the focused, deliberate way that difficult terrain demands. The snow worked in their favor in one sense. It would slow Silas's men coming up the approach trail and give Creston's people more time to organize. It worked against them in the obvious sense, which was that it was dangerous underfoot and cold, and they had a long way to go before they were in the valley. They didn't talk for the first 2 hours. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the trail required attention and the wind had come up enough to make conversation effortful. Rowan was aware of the cold in his hands despite his gloves, and he was aware of Evelyn behind him, the sound of her mare's hooves, the small adjustments she made when the terrain shifted. She didn't call out to him and she didn't fall behind, which told him she was managing. Around midday, the trail widened briefly onto a shelf of rock that was mostly blown clear of snow, and Rowan pulled up and waited for her to come alongside. "How are you?" he said. "Fine," she said, and then stopped herself. "Cold. The mare's getting tired. There's a hollow about 40 minutes down where there's shelter, and a creek that's probably still open. We can rest there." She nodded. She had snow on her coat and on the scarf around her head, and her face was reddened by the wind. She looked, he thought, extremely determined, which was something he'd noticed about her. She didn't look brave in the dramatic sense. She looked like a person who had decided to do something and was doing it, and was not spending energy on making it look like anything other than what it was. "When we get to Ash Hollow," she said, "I need to find May first." "May," he said. "She'll know what's happened in town while we've been gone. She'll know if Caleb is if he's all right." She adjusted her grip on the reins. "And she'll know who's there, who we can count on." Rowan had been thinking about that. The question of who in Ash Hollow was genuinely independent of Silas's reach. The answer was probably not as many as they needed, but some. There were always some. "Briggs," he said. "He owes Silas money, which means he's been paying for protection for years, which means if Silas's protection becomes uncertain,
Briggs will turn fast, she agreed. He's not loyal. He's invested. Those aren't the same thing. Who else? She thought about it as they started moving again down toward the hollow, the trail narrowing back to single file. She spoke over her shoulder. There are 3 families on the south end of Main Street. The Hawthorne family, the Wes, a widow named Garber who has a farm supply. They're not Silas's people. They just haven't been able to afford not to work with him. If they saw something shifting, she paused, they might shift with it. Might, Rowan said. Might, she confirmed. I won't promise you more than that. He didn't ask her to. Might was what they were working with across the board. Done. They reached the hollow in under 40 minutes and rested the horses in the shelter of a rock overhang where a thin creek ran dark and open between frozen edges. Rowan had hard biscuits and dried meat in his pack, and they ate without ceremony, sitting on rocks, and the horses drank from the creek and looked dissatisfied with the general situation in the way horses do when they have opinions about their working conditions. Evelyn ate methodically and didn't talk, which he'd learned meant she was thinking hard about something and using the silence for it. He let her have the silence. After a while, she said, "Tell me honestly what you think is going to happen." He chewed and thought about how to answer that honestly without being either falsely reassuring or uselessly dark. "I think we get into Ash Hollow before Silas gets back from Garner's Pass," he said. "That's the timing we're working with. We have the documents, we have Caleb if he's held, and we have whatever May can give us about who else is movable. And if we can get people assembled, the town, Caleb lays out what he has, in front of people, out in the open." He looked at her. "That's the part that matters most. Not a legal filing, not a letter to Crestline. The town hears it directly." "The town didn't do much for 11 years, she said. There was no self-pity in how she said it, just accuracy. "No," he agreed, but the town didn't know specifically what they were dealing with. What Silas had on Galt, what he had on Whitmore, the dairy didn't just leave on his own. He paused. "There's a difference between choosing not to see something and having it laid in front of you where you can't not see it." She was quiet for a moment. "You have a lot of faith in people." "Not particularly," he said. "But I have some. Enough." He looked at the creek, the dark water moving between the ice. "Most people aren't evil. They're just scared or comfortable or both. Take away the reason to be scared and give them a reason to act, and some of them will." "Some," she said again. "Some is enough. Enough has always been enough. Perfect unanimity is not how anything actually gets done." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between skepticism and something warmer that she wasn't ready to name yet. Then she stood up and brushed snow off her coat. "We should move." They came down into the valley as the afternoon light was going, that flat winter light that doesn't so much fade as simply decide to leave without explanation. The snow had eased off, and the sky above the valley was a deep gray blue, and Ash Hollow lay ahead of them across the open flat, its lights just beginning to show in windows as the early dark came on. Rowan felt the particular alertness that comes before something difficult. Not quite fear, not excitement, something more practical than either. A sharpening. The sense of time becoming precise and sequential in a way it isn't when nothing is at stake. They came into town from the north end, which avoided the main approach and the direct line of sight from the sheriff's office. They tied their horses behind May's diner in the alley, and Rowan knocked at the back door. May opened it after a short delay and looked at them, at Rowan, then at Evelyn. And her expression went through several things quickly before settling on something that wasn't quite relief and not quite the opposite. "You came back," she said to Evelyn. "I came back," Evelyn said. May stepped aside and they came into the kitchen, which was warm and smelled of coffee and bread and the remnants of the day's cooking. And May closed the door and bolted it in the quiet way of someone who had been keeping doors bolted lately. "Tell me," Rowan said. May poured coffee without asking and set it down and stood with her arms folded. "Silas left yesterday morning with Galt and a man I didn't recognize, well-dressed, older, rode like he wasn't used to mountain trails. 20-some men." "Whitmore," Evelyn said. "That's what I figured." May looked at her steadily. "Caleb is all right. He's been at his barn, visible, like your message said. He had a bad 2 days before it got here. Someone broke into the barn and went through his supplies looking for something. They didn't find the documents because he'd already moved them. She paused. He moved them to my place. They're here? Rowan said. Under the flour sacks, May said without particular drama.
Evelyn made a sound. Not quite a laugh, something close to it, the sound of tension releasing into an unexpected outcome. May, she said. Don't thank me yet, May said. Silas left a man here, a Galt deputy, young fellow named Pruis. He's been on Main Street since yesterday morning. He knows you're not in the county, and he knows he's supposed to notify someone if you come back, though I'm not clear who he'd notify with Galt gone north. She looked at Rowan. He's got a rifle, but he's 22, and I don't think he's fired it at anything more serious than a fence post. Who else is in town? Rowan said. About half the usual. Some people left when Silas rode out, either because they follow his business or because they got nervous about whatever's coming. She refilled her own cup. The Hawthorns are here, the Wests, Garber, Briggs, who's been in his store since yesterday with the curtains drawn. She paused. There are also 5 ranch hands who didn't ride with Silas. Either he didn't need them or didn't trust them to come, and now they're just in the saloon waiting to see what happens. The ranch hands, Evelyn said. Do you know which ones? One of them is Pena, May said. He was on the bunkhouse crew when Derry filed that complaint. Evelyn and Rowan looked at each other. Pena was one of the men who had signed Derry's complaint, one of the 5 who had allegedly decided to remember nothing. He's been drinking steadily for 2 days, May said. But he's been drinking the way a man drinks when he's trying to make a decision, not the way a man drinks when he's given up. There's a difference. Rowan set down his cup. He understood the shape of the next several hours now, or at least the shape he needed to push toward. It wasn't a plan so much as a sequence. Find Caleb, get the documents assembled, pull in whoever May thought was movable, and do it all before Silas turned back from Garner's Pass and came at them with 20 men and a judge. How long do we have? He said. May calculated. If they rode to Garner's Pass and didn't find you, they'd have to turn around and come back. Mountain trail's slower with that many men. And the snow. She looked at the window where the darkness outside was complete. You might have tonight. You might have until mid-morning tomorrow. Tonight then, Rowan said. So, Caleb Mercer was at his barn, as May had said, and when Rowan and Evelyn came through the side door, he stood up from his hay bale with the sharp movement of a man who has been waiting under sustained tension for long enough that his nerves have given up calibrating between real threats and minor sounds. He saw Evelyn, and something in his face did a complicated thing. Guilt and relief and something else. Something that took a moment to identify and turned out to be a kind of rueful recognition, like a man seeing clearly for the first time something he'd been blurring at the edges for years. You're here, he said. His voice was rough. I'm here, she said. Are you all right? More or less. He looked at Rowan. The documents. May has them. We'll get them before we need them. Rowan pulled up beside him. Pena is in town. Caleb went very still. Pena. He was on the crew when Derry filed, Rowan said. May thinks he's been sitting on something. You know him? I know him enough. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Walt Derry was his friend. They came out from Missouri together years back. He rubbed his jaw, the sound of it rough in the quiet barn. I didn't know Pena was still in the county. I thought he'd gone. He stayed, Evelyn said. Which means something, probably. Or he's just got nowhere else to go, Caleb said. But he didn't say it like he believed it. Either way, he's here, Rowan said. And he knows something about Derry that's in none of the documents because he was there and the documents weren't. We need that. You want me to talk to him, Caleb said. I want you to try, Rowan said. That's all I can ask. Caleb nodded slowly, the nod of a man accepting a weight he's been putting off accepting. Give me an hour, he said. It was closer to 90 minutes. Rowan spent the time getting the documents from May's kitchen, going through them one final time with Evelyn at the diner table in the lamplight, putting them in an order that would make sense to someone hearing them for the first time. Building a case the way you build a structure, foundation first, and then walls, and then the roof last. So the whole thing holds its own weight. Evelyn was good at this. Better than him, honestly. She had a legal clarity in how she assembled information that he suspected came from years of reading and rereading the documents she'd been secretly compiling. understanding not just what each piece proved, but how one piece connected to another, how the whole picture assembled from the parts. She reorganized 3 sections of what he'd laid out, and her version was better, and he said so. "You'd have gotten there," she said, not dismissively, just factually. "Maybe," he said. "Eventually." "We don't have eventually," she said. "So it's good we have now." May came in around 9 in the evening and said that the Hawthorns and the Wests and old Garber were willing to come to the saloon for a meeting. Briggs had been harder. She'd had to tell him specifically that Caleb had documentation of his arrangement with Silas regarding the grain alcohol watering scheme, which was a minor corruption compared to everything else, but was enough to make Briggs understand he had more to gain from the new arrangement than the old one. He'd agreed to come. The 5 ranch hands were already in the saloon. They hadn't been invited, but they were there. Caleb came back from the saloon at 9:30, with his coat rumpled and his eyes redder than they'd been before. He stood in the doorway of the diner, and Rowan looked at him and knew from the set of his jaw that it had worked, which was not the same as saying it had gone well. "Pena will talk," Caleb said. "He'll say what happened to Walt Derry." He stopped. "He's been carrying it for over a year. He knows where Derry is." His voice had gone flat in the particular way of a flat voice that is suppressing something because the alternative is not useful. It wasn't accidental. Galt handled it directly on Silas's order. Pena witnessed enough of it to know. The kitchen was very quiet. "He'll say it in front of people?" Evelyn said. "He'll say it," Caleb said. "He wanted to before. That's the thing. He wanted to, after Derry disappeared, and then he looked around at what happened to the men who'd signed the complaint, and he didn't." He looked at the floor. "He's been drinking for a year because he didn't." Rowan thought about that. About the particular damage of knowing something and not saying it and living inside that knowledge until it becomes its own kind of punishment. It was different from what Caleb had done, which was the damage of looking away. Pena had been looking directly at it, unable to look away, unable to speak, and drinking the gap between those two things. "He won't be the only one," Evelyn said quietly. "In this town, looking at something they can't look away from and can't speak about." She wasn't talking about Pena anymore exactly. She was talking about all of it. The entire 11 years, the entire infrastructure of silence that Silas had built and maintained, not just through power, but through making everyone in Ash Hollow a small participant in looking away. She was talking about what it meant to build a community on that foundation and what happened to the people who lived inside it. Rowan stood up. "We go to the saloon," he said. The Ash Hollow Saloon was not a large building, and with 15 people in it and the wood stove going, it was close and warm and smelled of sawdust and the residue of years of drink. The ranch hands were at the far end of the bar. The Hawthorns and Wests and Garber had taken the tables in the middle. Briggs was near the door like a man who hadn't fully committed to being in the room. Ott the bartender stood behind the bar doing nothing, which was the right instinct. When Rowan and Evelyn and Caleb came in, the room went still in the particular way of a room waiting to understand what kind of thing this is going to be. Deputy Pruce was not in the saloon. May had determined that he was at the sheriff's office and would likely stay there through the night unless something drew him out. The calculation was that whatever happened in the saloon in the next hour would draw him out, and then they'd deal with him when it came to that. Caleb stood in the middle of the room and didn't try to be anyone other than what he was, which was a frightened man who had decided to stop being frightened in the one specific way that mattered. He laid the documents on the nearest table, his documents, then Evelyn's, then the copy of the agreement with Whitmore, and he started talking. He was not eloquent. He repeated himself in places and got the dates slightly confused on 2 of the entries and had to correct himself, which he did without trying to cover it, just saying, "No, I've got that wrong. It was February, not March," in the straightforward way of someone more interested in being accurate than in being impressive. He talked for 20 minutes without stopping. The room listened. When he finished, Evelyn stood up. She didn't ask anyone's permission, and she didn't wait to be introduced. She stood up and she looked at the people in that room. Hawthorne and his wife, the Wests with their careful faces, old Garber with her arms folded, the ranch hands at the bar, Briggs by the door. And she said, "I've lived in this town for 11 years. Most of you have watched what Silas Crow did to me in that time. I know you have, because it happened in the open. The sidewalk, the store, the town square." Her voice was level. I'm not telling you that to make you feel guilty. I'm telling you because what happened to me in public is the part Silas didn't care if you saw. What's in these documents is the part he needed you not to see. She talked about Whitmore. She talked about Galt. She talked about the specific entries in the financial record, and she was more precise than Caleb had been because she had been preparing this argument in her head for 3 years. She talked about Walt Derry, what she knew of it, and said that Pena knew more and was willing to say it. From the end of the bar, Pena made a sound, not exactly confirmation, more like a man whose held breath finally becomes audible. He was a stocky, dark-haired man in his mid-30s who looked like someone who hadn't found a comfortable position in a long time. When Evelyn said his name, he looked up, and the look on his face was the look of a person who has been waiting without knowing they were waiting. "Pena," Caleb said, quietly. Pena straightened. He looked at the room. The ordinary, imperfect, not particularly brave collection of people in Ash Hollow. And he said, "Walt Derry didn't leave town." He said it simply, and the room received it simply, and the silence that followed was the silence of something that had been present in a different form for a long time, taking its actual shape at last. He told them what he knew. It took about 10 minutes, and he did not embellish it. He just said what he had seen and heard and understood, the way a man testifies when he's done arguing with himself about whether to. When he finished, he looked down at the bar and didn't say anything else. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Then Mrs. Hawthorne said, "What do we do?" Rowan answered her. "The documents go to the federal marshal's office in Delwater. I've already sent a courier. He should be there by now. What we need from this town is witnesses to this conversation and people willing to put their names to what they've heard tonight." He looked at the room. Not heroes. Not people who want to fight anyone. Just people willing to say what they heard. Briggs made a small noise from near the door. "If Silas comes back..." "Silas is going to come back," Rowan said. "That's a fact. The question is whether he comes back to a town that's already on record or a town that's still keeping his secrets." Briggs looked at the documents on the table and at Evelyn and at the floor, in that order, which was the sequence of a man recalculating. It was the Hawthorne woman who said it first. "I'll put my name to it." Her husband, after a pause. "And mine." The Wests together, almost simultaneously. Old Garber said, "I've been wanting someone to give me a reason for 11 years. This is a reason." Briggs said nothing for long enough that it became its own kind of statement, and then he said, "Fine," in the voice of a man making a business decision he's not happy about. The ranch hands at the bar were last. 3 of them signed without significant hesitation. The 4th took longer, looking at his hands on the bar, and then signed. The 5th said he needed to think about it, which was honest, and nobody pressured him. Pena didn't sign a paper. He said, "I'll say it in front of a marshal, in writing if they need it," which was worth more than a signature in this room. But it was past midnight when the sound of horses came. Not from the north, which was the Garners Pass direction. From the south, the main road in. Which meant it wasn't Silas coming back. It was someone coming from outside Ash Hollow entirely. Rowan was at the saloon window when the first rider came into the lamplight of Main Street. He didn't recognize the man or the horse, and then he saw the coat. The federal marshal's office used a specific style of oilskin trail coat that you could identify from a distance once you'd seen it. And he understood. Taggart had made the round trip in 8 days, which was faster than Rowan had thought possible, which meant he'd pushed hard and the marshal had not delayed. There were 3 of them. The marshal himself, a tall, weathered man named Ives, who dismounted in front of the sheriff's office and looked around Ash Hollow with the comprehensive assessment of someone taking in a situation for the first time, and 2 deputies. Rowan went out to meet him. The cold hit him immediately after the warmth of the saloon. "Marshal Ives," he said. "Mr. Voss?" The marshal's handshake was brief and businesslike. "Your courier was persuasive. The documentation he carried was more persuasive." He looked at the saloon. "I was told there are witnesses. About a dozen in there right now. More if we need them. And the judge, Whitmore. He rode north this morning with Silas Crow toward Garner's Pass. He should be coming back sometime tomorrow morning." Marshal Ives looked at him steadily. "You understand that my jurisdiction here is federal offenses only. The bribery charge on Whitmore is clearly federal. Crow's activities, Crow's activities include the death of a man named Walt Derry at the direction of a sitting sheriff, which I'd argue falls under federal jurisdiction when the local law is the instrument of the crime, Rowan said. Ives considered this. I'll need to hear the witness before I commit to that. His name is Pena. He's inside. Then let's go inside. Deputy Pruis came out of the sheriff's office at that moment, drawn by the sound of horses, and he stood on the steps and took in the 3 federal coats and Rowan beside them and the general quality of the situation, and he made the calculation that a 22-year-old man makes when he understands that whatever he was sent to hold together has already moved past the point where he can hold it. Deputy, Marshal Ives said, not unkindly, go back inside and stay there until I come to speak to you. Pruis went back inside. Now, what happened in the next hour inside the Ash Hollow Saloon was not orderly, and it was not quick, and it was not anything like what anyone would call a legal proceeding, which Marshal Ives acknowledged openly by saying, "This is not formal testimony. This is me determining whether there's grounds to act tonight. Formal testimony comes later, in front of a proper court." He listened to Caleb. He read the documents with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who read documents professionally. He listened to Pena, who said what he'd said before, this time to a federal officer, and who was steadier than he'd been the first time, as if saying it once had taken the worst of the weight off it, and what remained was manageable. He listened to Evelyn last. She gave him the copy of the Whitmore Agreement and the financial records, and walked him through the timeline she'd built from 11 years of observed details, and the marshal listened without interrupting except for 2 precise questions that told her he understood what he was hearing and was tracking it carefully. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the table. I can issue a warrant for Whitmore tonight, he said. On the bribery evidence, that's straightforward. Crow, he paused. The case against Crow is more complex. Pena's testimony is strong, but it's a single witness to an event from over a year ago, and Crow's attorneys will argue strenuously. Will they argue it in a court where Whitmore isn't the judge? Evelyn said.
They will, Ives said. Yes, and that's a different conversation than they've been having. He looked at her directly, and there was something in his look that was not pity. It was more like the recognition one careful person extends to another. Mrs. Crow? Cross, she said.
Mrs. Cross, he said without blinking, I'm going to be honest with you about what this process looks like. It's not fast and it's not clean. Crow has resources and lawyers and he's going to use them. This case could run for a year or more in the territorial courts. I know, she said. I've known that. She met his eyes. I didn't start this expecting it to be easy. I started it expecting it to be necessary. Ives nodded once. All right, he said. When Whitmore comes back in the morning, the saloon door opened. The cold came in before anyone did, and then Silas Crow walked through it. He was alone, which was wrong. The 20 men should have been behind him, but he'd ridden hard ahead of them, which meant he'd come back faster than the trail should have allowed, which meant he'd pushed his horse to the edge of what the animal could do in snow in the dark, which meant he'd known, or suspected, and hadn't been able to wait. He stood in the doorway of his own town saloon and looked at the room, at the people gathered there, at the documents on the table, at the federal coats, at Caleb, at Evelyn, and his face did something Rowan had not seen it do before. It lost the pleasantness. Not the anger, he was angry, clearly, the white-knuckled, controlled anger of a man whose control is the thing he's most proud of. But the pleasantness that had always sat on top of the anger like a lid on a pot, that was gone. What was underneath it was plainer and uglier and more honest. He looked at Evelyn. You come home, he said. Not a request, not even quite a command. Something more like a reflex. The thing his mouth said because it had been saying it for 11 years. No, she said. You are my wife. Marshal Ives, Evelyn said, keeping her eyes on Silas. This is Silas Crow. Ives stood up. Mr. Crow? I'm Federal Marshal Ives. I have some questions for you. Silas looked at him. The calculation in his eyes was visible. Not panicked, not yet, but recalibrating. He was still a man who believed he could work with a situation. Whatever you've been told, he started. I've been given documentation and witness testimony, Ives said. I'll want your response to specific charges in the morning, with proper representation if you choose. Tonight, I'm informing you that a warrant has been prepared for Territorial Judge Whitmore on federal bribery charges. Something moved across Silas's face. He'd built 11 years, 20 years, probably more, on the architecture of Whitmore's cooperation. Every land dispute, every legal instrument used against tenants and debtors, and people who challenged him, every time the law had bent his direction because Whitmore was the law, all of that had just changed shape. Whitmore has nothing to do with, he began. The agreement in your handwriting with his countersignature says otherwise, Evelyn said. The copy I made from your lockbox 3 years ago. The room was very still.
Silas looked at her, and what was in his face now was something she had seen before. That specific variety of cold fury that preceded the worst moments. She had spent 11 years learning to manage her responses to that look. She sat with it now, and she did not manage it away. She just sat there and held his gaze, and she did not move from where she was.
Rowan had come to stand about 6 feet to Silas's left, not behind Evelyn, not between them, to the side, present, in Silas's peripheral vision. Silas noticed. He'd always noticed Rowan, specifically and personally, the way men notice the particular thing that unmade their certainty. You are not going to walk out of this, Silas said to Rowan, abandoning everything else in the room in the manner of a man narrowing his attention to what he hates most. Whatever this looks like to you tonight, Mr. Crow, Ives's voice was sharp and flat. Sit down. Silas didn't look at him. He reached. It happened in the time it takes to draw a breath. The moment collapsing from slow tension into fast violence without a midpoint. Silas's hand went to his coat, and Rowan moved, not toward Silas, sideways, catching Silas's arm at the wrist with both hands, and rotating in the way that a man who has worked with his hands for 30 years can rotate something that needs moving, until the leverage was wrong for Silas and right for Rowan. And the gun hit the floorboards, and Silas hit the bar on his way down and came to rest against it, breathing hard. It was not a clean takedown. Silas got an elbow into Rowan's ribs that would leave a significant bruise, and Rowan slammed his own shoulder into the edge of the bar in the process, and said something under his breath that was not appropriate for polite company. Neither of them was unmarked by it. But Silas was on the floor and his gun was not in his hand. Marshal Ives's deputies had their weapons out. The room had gone completely still in the particular shocked stillness of people who have just seen violence happen in real time, rather than at a story's distance. All right, Ives said into the silence. He looked at Silas on the floor and at Rowan, who was standing with one hand on the bar and his other arm at his side in a way that said the ribs were making themselves known. All right, he said again, quieter. Silas did not try to get up immediately. He lay against the base of the bar with his chest heaving and looked at the ceiling of his town saloon. And some part of what he was looking at was the distance between what this room had been this morning and what it was now. And the distance was too large for whatever he'd built himself on. Walter Derry, Pena said from the end of the bar. He said it simply, to no one in particular, or to everyone, or to Silas specifically. His name was Walter Derry, and he worked hard and he just wanted what he was owed. Nobody answered him, but the words sat in the room and did not leave. Rowan stepped back from Silas and straightened up carefully, feeling the ribs, and Ives's deputies moved in, and between that and the weight of 20 people watching, Silas Crow stayed on the floor. Evelyn did not look away from him. She sat at the table with the documents in front of her and the lamplight on her face, and she looked at the man who had owned 11 years of her life, and she let herself look at him fully, not with triumph, not with the satisfaction she might have imagined in some private version of this moment, but with the careful, clear-eyed look of a person seeing something for exactly what it is. No more and no less. He looked smaller than he had ever looked, not because he was on the floor, because the room had changed around him and he hadn't, and the distance between what he was and what the world was becoming in this saloon was the measure of how small he actually was. Outside, the snow had stopped. The street was quiet. Somewhere in Ash Hollow, a door opened and then closed, the ordinary sound of a town going on, the way towns go on through everything that happens inside them, carrying their history forward into whatever comes next, shaped by it whether they choose to be or not. Whitmore arrived back in Ash Hollow at 9:30 the following morning. He came down the main road with 8 of Silas's men behind him, the rest having apparently scattered somewhere between Garner's Pass and the valley when the news reached them that something had gone wrong in town. Word travels fast in mountain country when it has reason to, faster than horses sometimes. through the network of settlements and homesteads and mining camps that share information the way they share water, because both are survival. Some of the ranch hands had likely gone home. Some had probably just decided that whatever Silas Crow was paying them was not enough for whatever this was becoming. Whitmore did not know what was waiting for him until he was already on Main Street, and it was too late to turn back without it looking like exactly what it would have been. Marshal Ives was standing in front of the sheriff's office. His two deputies flanked him. Behind them, through the open door, Silas Crow was visible sitting in the cell with the broken lock that Galt had never fixed, which was functional enough with the deputy sitting outside it. Whitmore pulled his horse up and looked at all of this with the expression of a man whose stomach has dropped, but whose face has not received the information yet. He was older than Rowan had pictured, late 60s, with white hair and a quality of groomed authority that came from decades of sitting at the front of courtrooms. He wore his fancy coat, and he sat his horse well even now, even with the evidence of disaster in front of him. Whatever else he was not someone who fell apart visibly, and Rowan, watching from across the street beside Evelyn, found himself thinking that was its own kind of information about what it took to maintain corruption for 20 years. You had to be good at surfaces. Marshal Ives, Whitmore said. His voice was controlled and resonant in the cold morning air. Judge Whitmore, Ives said, please dismount. The 8 men behind Whitmore looked at each other in the way of men processing a situation whose rules have changed since they last checked. None of them were Hendricks. Hendricks had apparently remained in Garner's Pass for reasons that were not yet clear and probably wouldn't be for some time. Without Hendricks, the group had a leaderless quality, and leaderless groups facing federal authority tend to make the practical calculation faster. Whitmore dismounted. He handed his reins to the nearest rider without looking at him and walked toward Ives with the measured pace of a man buying himself seconds to think. I assume there's been a misunderstanding, he said. I have a warrant, Ives said. I'll explain the charges inside. I am a territorial judge. You're a man with a warrant issued against him, Ives said. The title doesn't change that. Whitmore looked at Ives for a long moment with the look of a man who has used his authority to end conversations for so many years that he has almost forgotten what it feels like when it doesn't work. Then he looked past Ives at the cell through the office door, at Silas sitting in it. Silas, who had not stood up or looked toward the door, who was sitting with his forearms on his knees and his head slightly down. The posture of a man who has been in that position long enough that adjusting it would take more energy than he currently has. Something moved across Whitmore's face. Not guilt exactly, more like the belated understanding that he had built something on sand, and had been so certain of the architecture that he'd forgotten what the foundation was. He went inside without further argument. Evelyn watched it from across the street and felt less than she'd expected to feel. She had imagined, in the abstract, that this moment would carry some particular emotional weight. The sight of Whitmore walking through that door, the knowledge that the legal apparatus that had protected Silas for over a decade was now being turned against him. She had imagined something large and clarifying. What she actually felt was tired and cold, and more aware of the bruise on her left heel from 2 days of riding than seemed appropriate for a significant moment. She thought about that for a moment, the gap between how you expect things to feel and how they actually feel. And then she thought that probably the expectation of significance was its own kind of trap. Things don't feel the way they're supposed to feel. They feel the way they feel, which is usually smaller and stranger and more physical than the version you imagined. Are you all right? Rowan said beside her. My feet hurt, she said. He looked at her sideways. That's it? That and everything else, she said. But mostly my feet right now. He nodded, accepting this as a reasonable answer, which was one of the things about Rowan Voss that she had come to value without planning to. He accepted what you told him and didn't push for the more dramatic version. May came out of the diner with 2 cups of coffee and handed them over without ceremony. The 3 of them stood on the wooden sidewalk in the cold morning and drank coffee and watched Marshal Ives's deputies manage the 8 ranch hands, who were in the process of being questioned individually about what they did and didn't know, and what their formal relationship to the Crow operation was. It was not a morning that would be written up anywhere as a decisive turning point. It was just a cold Thursday in Ash Hollow, with too many people and not enough heat, and a situation that was going to take a long time to resolve. And the people standing in the middle of it were ordinary and tired and mostly wanted to sit down. The formal process, as Marshal Ives had warned, was not fast. The warrants for Whitmore and Silas were processed through the federal court in Mill Haven, a larger town 3 days east, which had a proper courthouse and a judge who had no financial relationship with either defendant. The cases were separated. Whitmore's federal bribery charge was cleaner and moved first, while the case against Silas on the charges related to Walt Derry and the systematic corruption of local law enforcement required the kind of evidentiary work that takes months to build properly, Caleb testified. He went to Mill Haven in late November in a wagon with Ives's deputy riding alongside, and he sat in a formal courtroom and said what he had been saying since that first night in the saloon, and this time it was on record and under oath and in front of people who had the authority to do something with it. He was not a polished witness. He repeated himself and got nervous, and once lost his place entirely and had to ask the court to give him a moment, which they did. He found his place again and finished. Pena testified about Derry. That was the hardest day of the whole proceedings, by most accounts. A man describing clearly and plainly what he had seen happen to his friend, in a room full of strangers, with the weight of over a year of carrying it, making his voice rough in places and his hands unsteady. He got through it. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Caleb found him sitting on the steps and sat down next to him, and they didn't say anything to each other for a long time, which was probably what both of them needed. Evelyn testified in December, on a day when the temperature had dropped below zero, and the courthouse heating was inadequate for the crowd inside. She wore her good boots and the coat that Rowan had bought her in Garner's Pass, a proper wool coat, lined, that fit correctly, and she sat in the witness chair and spoke for nearly 2 hours. She was precise and thorough, and she did not cry, not because she didn't feel anything, but because crying was not what the situation required, and she had learned over 11 years to deploy her resources where they were needed. She talked about the financial records. She talked about Whitmore's arrangement, the copies she'd made, the methodology she'd used to document it. She talked about what she had witnessed and overheard over 11 years of living inside Silas Crow's operations. She talked about Walt Derry, what she knew of the circumstances, and when she had understood what had happened. She talked about the specific incidents of abuse, the sidewalk, the town square, dozens of private moments that she had cataloged with the same careful accuracy she'd applied to the financial records, dates, and specifics written in the same small hand on the backs of the same household lists. The defense attorney asked her on cross-examination whether she had any corroboration for the personal accounts. She said, "Half the town of Ash Hollow watched it happen for 7 years. You can ask them." The attorney did not ask any further questions on that subject. Whitmore was convicted in January. The federal bribery charge carried a sentence of 7 years, and there were additional territorial charges pending related to the land boundary rulings that had enriched Silas at the expense of smaller landowners across the county. His lawyer was already appealing, which was expected, and the appeal was going to take time, which was also expected, and Evelyn had accepted both of those facts without the anger that some people expected her to feel about them. 7 years isn't enough, May said when the verdict came through. Maybe not, Evelyn said, but he's gone from the bench permanently regardless of the appeal. No ruling he made in the past 6 years will be considered uncontested. All the land cases he decided in Silas's favor. She looked at May. Those all get reviewed. May thought about this. The Alderson family, she said. The Aldersons were a farming family who had lost a water rights dispute 3 years ago that had effectively killed their operation. And the Prentice claim. Among others, Evelyn said. That's the part that matters longer than 7 years. May refilled the coffee and was quiet for a moment. You're very practical about this. I've had to be, Evelyn said. I can't afford to measure this by what I feel it should be. I can only look at what it actually does. Silas's case took until the following spring to come to trial. In the intervening months, the Crow Ranch went through a sequence of administrative and financial complications that were almost architectural in their unraveling. Contracts canceled, creditors appearing, ranch hands who had stayed through the winter dispersing as it became clear that whatever the Crow operation had been was not going to exist in its previous form. The Crow cattle were eventually sold at auction to satisfy debts, which was not a dramatic event. Just a Tuesday morning with buyers from 3 different counties, and the ranch hands loading and sorting, and the numbers getting recorded by a court-appointed administrator. Ash Hollow itself went through its own quieter unraveling. Galt resigned in November, the week after Whitmore's arrest, sending a letter to the territorial administration that cited personal reasons and was not believed by anyone. The territory appointed an interim sheriff from outside the county, a woman named Basso from Delwater, who was 40 and serious and had no previous relationship with anyone in Ash Hollow, which was the point. She arrived with 2 deputies and read every file in the sheriff's office with methodical attention and then reorganized the filing system, which had apparently needed it badly. Some people left Ash Hollow. Not a flood, just a steady trickle of the people whose presence in town had been contingent on Silas's infrastructure. The men who'd run small operations in his shadow, the couple of merchants who'd been supplying the ranch exclusively and found themselves without a primary customer. The town got smaller, and smaller had a way of feeling different in Ash Hollow than it might have elsewhere, because the town had been built big on borrowed power, and what was left when the borrowing ended was something more honest and considerably more modest. The people who stayed were the ones who'd been there on their own terms. The Hawthorns, the Wests, Garber with her farm supply, May with her diner, Caleb with his supply routes. Briggs stayed, which surprised some people and didn't surprise others. He had stopped watering the grain alcohol, which was noticed and appreciated, and he had settled his outstanding debt with the territory, which had been quietly hanging over him for years, and which, once paid, seemed to physically lighten him in some way that was visible in how he moved around his own store. Silas Crow went to trial in April, on a day that was genuinely warm for the first time since October, the kind of spring morning that feels like an argument for patience. The charges were corruption of public officials, conspiracy in the disappearance and death of Walter Derry, systematic wage theft from the bunkhouse crew, and a series of land fraud charges arising from the Whitmore ruling reviews. He sat at the defense table in the Millhaven courthouse with 2 lawyers and the expensive, groomed composure that he'd maintained through the winter, not broken, not contrite, just contained, as if the trial were a weather event he was waiting out. His lawyers were good. They challenged the provenance of documents, questioned the reliability of testimony, raised procedural issues about the circumstances of his arrest. They were doing their job and they were doing it well. None of it was enough. It was not enough because the evidence was thorough and because there were too many witnesses and because Peña's testimony about Walter Derry was specific and consistent and carried the unmistakable quality of something a person says because they cannot carry it anymore. And juries recognize that quality even without being told to look for it. Silas was convicted on all primary charges. He received 22 years, which was a long sentence for the territory and which the defense immediately appealed. The appeal was legitimate. His lawyers were right about 2 of the procedural challenges, and it would take time and might reduce the sentence. But the conviction stood, and the conviction meant that everything Silas Crow had built in Ash Hollow County over 30 years had been officially named for what it was. Evelyn was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She was sitting in the gallery beside Rowan and behind Caleb, and when the foreman said the words, she felt the same thing she'd felt watching Whitmore walk through the sheriff's office door. Smaller than she'd expected, and more physical. Her hands in her lap. The courtroom noise around her, people moving, voices, the sound of chairs. Rowan's shoulder close to hers. She did not cry. She had been expecting not to cry, but she also had not been certain, and the not crying came with a small additional feeling that was like putting something down that you've been carrying for so long you'd forgotten you were carrying it. Not relief exactly, just the absence of the weight. That's a different thing. She looked at Silas across the courtroom. He was looking at his lawyers, not at the gallery, which was probably the correct professional advice for this moment. She thought about what she'd wanted from this, not from the trial specifically, but from all of it. From the morning she'd walked 2 miles in the dark to find a man by the livery stable who might have a plan. She had wanted to not be in that house anymore. She had wanted to say what she knew in a place where it was heard. She had wanted Ash Hollow, or whoever was left of it, to have to know the thing they'd spent 11 years not knowing. Those things had happened. Imperfectly, slowly, with complications and setbacks and a great deal of cold weather and bad sleep, and the grinding, unglamorous work of building a legal case piece by piece in the territory of a country that made this kind of thing deliberately difficult. But they had happened. That was going to have to be enough, and she had decided sometime over the winter that it was. The question of what came next had been answering itself gradually over the months between October and April, in the particular way that things answer themselves when you are too busy dealing with the present to be anxious about the future. Evelyn was working. She had started keeping books for the Garner's Pass mining operation in November, which Creston had offered her because it was what he needed, and because she was, as he told Rowan with characteristic directness, better at this than anyone I've found in 20 years of trying. She had taken a room at the boarding house in Garner's Pass and paid for it herself and organized it the way she organized everything, with precision and without sentimentality about what it wasn't. She had also, by the end of winter, begun doing something she hadn't done since before her marriage, cooking for other people in a way that was about the food and not the performance of having dinner ready at the right time. May had taught her a few things when Evelyn had stayed at the diner through November before going back to Garner's Pass, and those had combined with what she already knew, which was considerable, and she had started cooking on weekend evenings in the boarding house kitchen for whoever was around, which was usually Miners and occasionally Creston's family, and once, memorably, Marshall Ives passing through on another matter who had eaten 2 full plates and said very little except that it was good. It was not a dramatic existence. It was just hers, which was the thing she'd been working toward without being entirely sure of what the destination looked like. Rowan was at the forge. He had gone back to Garner's Pass in October after the situation in Ash Hollow was stable enough to leave, and he'd finished the hinges for the community hall and the wheel rim for Kolb and found another commission for the mining operation that was going to keep him busy through winter. He worked long hours, which was his nature, and in the evenings he was usually at the boarding house because it was warm and the food had gotten significantly better since November. They had not made any formal declarations about what they were to each other. The situation had developed in the way of things between people who are both fundamentally practical and who have both been made careful by experience, slowly, with long silences that were not uncomfortable, with honesty in the place of performance. He had told her in January that he was glad she was in Garner's Pass, which was not a romantic statement exactly, but was, from him, a significant one, and she had received it as such. She had told him in February that she found the work satisfying in a way she'd forgotten work could be satisfying, and that she didn't know yet what she wanted the next several years to look like, but that she was for the first time in over a decade interested in finding out. He had nodded at that with the understanding of a person who recognizes what it costs someone to say something that is both true and vulnerable, and he hadn't made it larger than it was. That was enough. That was, actually, more than enough. By the time summer came to Garner's Pass, 2 of the abandoned cabins on the upper end of the settlement had occupants. The first was a woman named Rosa Steen, who had walked into Garner's Pass in May with 2 children and a broken arm that had been set wrong by someone who hadn't known what they were doing. She had come from a homestead 3 days east, and she had not said much about why she'd left except that she wasn't going back. Evelyn had helped her settle the children and had gone to Creston about the cabin and had found Rosa work helping with the cooking operations for the mining crew, which Rosa turned out to be extremely good at. The second was a young man named Darrow, barely 20, who had a talent for mechanics and no good situation to use it in, who had heard through the mining network that there was a forge at Garner's Pass and that the blacksmith there might be willing to teach. He was not the most graceful apprentice. He dropped things and asked too many questions and had to be told twice about respecting the heat, but he learned, which was the thing that mattered. By midsummer, there were 3 more people in Garner's Pass than there had been in the fall, and the settlement had the quality of a place that is still figuring out what it is, but has decided it exists, which is the first step. Evelyn thought about this sometimes, about how things accumulate, how a settlement becomes a community, how the difference between the two is not size or resources or geography, but whether people have decided to be responsible to each other. Ash Hollow had been a settlement for 30 years, and had not become a community until the night 20 people sat in a saloon and put their names on a piece of paper. It might become something real now, or it might not. She checked in with May by letter every few weeks, and May's reports were cautiously optimistic, which for May was close to enthusiastic. She did not go back to Ash Hollow often. She went twice in that first year, once in the fall to testify in a property review case related to the Whitmore rulings, once in the spring for the trial. Both times she walked Main Street with the particular awareness of someone in a place that has changed its meaning, every building carrying 2 versions of itself, what it was and what it is.
The sidewalk outside Briggs's store.
The spot in front of the general store where she'd stood in the cold in October. She stood there once, on her second visit, and looked at the wooden boards and thought about the morning that had started all of it. Not the sidewalk that had just been the visible surface. The real starting point was harder to locate. Maybe the morning she'd started copying documents onto the backs of household lists. Maybe the 11 years before that, all of it compressing into the 3 years she'd spent building a case she didn't know she'd have a reason to use. Maybe the moment she'd heard a question, "You want to go to the wagon?" and surprised herself by answering honestly. She thought about what it takes to stand up. Not the dramatic version, not the single heroic moment, the one choice that changes everything. But the real version, which is slower and less clean and involves a long accumulation of smaller decisions that don't feel significant individually and turn out to be everything collectively. The decision to keep a record. The decision to send a letter. The decision to say no instead of yes to a man who had built an 11-year case for why no was impossible. She thought about Rowan, who had walked past her on a sidewalk and stopped, and about how a thing that small, one person stopping when everyone else kept moving, had changed the shape of what she thought was possible. Not because he'd saved her. She had been saving herself, in the slow, careful way available to her, for 3 years before that morning. But because he'd shown her that the outside world had not entirely agreed to the version of reality Silas had been building, and that knowledge had changed her calculation about timing. She thought about Caleb, who had carried his documents for 9 years, and his guilt for over a year about dairy, and who was, by all accounts, drinking less and sleeping better, who had paid a debt that could never be fully paid, and was living with that, which was the most any of us can do about the things we failed at before we stopped failing at them. She thought about Pena, who had moved on from Ash Hollow after the trial, gone west toward the coast, which was probably good for him and possibly necessary. She thought about what it costs to say a true thing in a room full of people who have reason to not want to hear it, and she thought that this was maybe the most human act there is. Not bravery in the spectacular sense, but the simpler and more difficult thing of refusing to let something be unsaid when saying it is what truth requires. Rowan found her on the sidewalk outside Briggs's store on that second visit. He had ridden down with her. He usually rode down with her when she went to Ash Hollow, not because she needed him to, but because he wanted to, and she had stopped arguing about the things he did because he wanted to. And he'd gone to settle the horses while she walked Main Street, and now he came around the corner and found her standing in front of the general store looking at the boards. He stood beside her and looked at the same spot. "Thinking?" he said. "About the first morning," she said. "The coat." He looked at the sidewalk. "Cold morning." "Yes," she said. "You looked annoyed." He glanced at her. "I wasn't annoyed." "You looked like a man who had intended to buy iron stock and was now doing something else," she said. "That's accurate," he said. "That's not the same as annoyed." She almost smiled, the short, gone-quickly version that was hers specifically. "What were you, if not annoyed?" He thought about it with the honesty he applied to everything. "Certain," he said, "about what I was doing, less certain about what came after." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm still less certain about what comes after. In general." "Me too," she said. They stood on the sidewalk in the spring light, which was nothing like October, which was warm and direct and indifferent to the history of the boards beneath them. A wagon went past on Main Street. A child ran by, chasing something or being chased, too fast to be sure. Ash Hollow went on around them, ordinary and imperfect and still becoming something. The way things are always still becoming something, as long as there are people inside them willing to do the work. "We should head back before the light goes," Rowan said. "We should," she agreed. She didn't move immediately. She looked at the sidewalk one more time, not with the weight of memory, but with the look of someone completing something. Confirming that it happened, that it was real, that the history is in the boards and in the records, and in the testimony of people who put their names on paper, and that this, whatever this is, belongs to the past and not to the present in the way it used to. Then she turned away from it and walked with him toward where the horses were, and the spring sun was on the street, and there were things that still needed doing, and Garner's Pass was 2 hours up the mountain, and that was where they were going. Not everything was resolved. The appeal on Silas's sentence was still pending. The property review cases would run for another year at least. Pena was somewhere on the western coast trying to build something out of the wreckage of what a year of silence had made of him. Walt Derry was buried on the eastern side of Ash Hollow in a plot that Caleb had paid for, and buried properly, which was not justice but was acknowledgement. An acknowledgement is the thing that keeps the dead from being disappeared twice. And Evelyn Cross was walking toward a horse in spring sunlight, with work waiting for her in a mountain settlement that was becoming something beside a man who had stopped when everyone else kept walking. And she was 35 years old and she was not finished, and she knew it. That was in the end the only thing worth knowing. Not that suffering ends cleanly, because it doesn't. Not that the right people face the right consequences in the right proportions, because the math never works out exactly. Not that everything you endure gets made meaningful by what comes after, because meaning is not a consolation prize that arrives automatically. What was worth knowing was simpler than any of that. That a person can be reduced almost to nothing by a sustained effort to make them nothing, and still contain, somewhere underneath the exhausted compliance and the practiced blankness and the 11 years of standing in the cold, still contain the thing that looks at the mountains and thinks about what's on the other side. That thing can wait. That it does not require rescue to survive. Only the right moment, and the courage to recognize it, and the willingness to move.